Among the provinces, Africa changed the fastest. Before his death, Julius Caesar made Numidia into a Roman province. He gave its capital, Cirta, to a soldier named Citius and his mixed army of Romans, Spaniards, and Berbers. This area became a large colony, with good farmland available at low prices and ruled by Roman laws. More importantly, Caesar began rebuilding Carthage to serve as a port for older Roman settlements. He had also fined 300 wealthy Romans who supported the Senate's side in Africa. Each paid about $12,000, which shows how much land they owned. That land likely went up for sale. When we look at African inscriptions from Augustus's time, we can see that many Roman citizens moved to Africa just as Italians were being forced out of land at home. Several older coastal towns, like Hippo, Corubis, Neapolis, Carpus, and Simithu, say they were revived by settlers during this period. Even though they weren't made official Roman colonies, many Roman migrants settled there and were allowed by Augustus to create local self-government alongside the native systems. Actual colonies of retired soldiers were also set up in places like Uthina, Thuburbo, and Sicca, as seen in inscriptions. Interestingly, when these towns were revived by Roman settlers, many descendants of the old Punic people came back. As a result, towns like Carthage and Hippo became partly Punic again, as shown by temples and tombs dedicated to Punic gods like Baal-Ammon and Tanit. These Punic communities were even allowed to govern themselves locally and minted their own coins. Africa then grew from the mixture of Roman and Punic people. Small towns turned into cities, and this helped boost farming, trade, and industry. Aside from settling veterans and allowing some local autonomy, Augustus mostly let Africa develop on its own. With time, its natural resources brought success. By the end of Augustus' reign, Africa, after Egypt, was the empire's second biggest supplier of wheat. Spain, on the other hand, was still complex and confusing. The south was warm, very fertile, and filled with old cities. The central plateau was high, dry, and sparsely populated, with strong-willed village people. The north and northwest had mountain tribes who hunted and herded animals and lived freely. The Mediterranean coast had old trading cities influenced by Greek and Punic trade for centuries. Each part of Spain was different in culture. Most of the people across Spain were Iberians, who originally came from North Africa and were related to the Berbers. The central part was called Celt-Iberian, but that only means the Celts had entered the area around the 5th century BC. Later, the Iberians pushed many of them back into Gaul. By Augustus' time, Iberians were the main group everywhere in Spain. In the south and east, the people had interacted with Greek culture for over 1,000 years. Spain was also known for its rich mines, which made it very important in the ancient world. Gold, silver, and copper came from the Sierra Morena Mountains and were sent out through cities like Gades and others on the eastern coast. The famous tin mines in the northwest were reached by ships or land caravans. Traders from many cultures came to the Iberian coast over time. First were the Mycenaeans from Crete, then the Phoenicians, Etruscans, Greeks, Carthaginians, and finally the Romans. Each group took advantage of the local Iberians and taught them new skills and crafts. Mining in Spain was very advanced and well organized. Spanish steel swords were highly valued in ancient times, just as they continued to be in later history. Spain also produced high-quality linen and wool fabrics, made from local flax and wool using complex looms. Greek travelers even praised Spain's carefully bred sheep and cattle. Vineyards, olive groves, and exotic fruits from Africa were planted early, especially in Andalusia, even before the Romans arrived. In the south, Under Phoenician influence from cities like Gades and Malacca, the Turdetani people became wealthy and lived in self-governing cities. On the eastern coast, close contact with Greeks sparked some artistic development, but this faded after the Greeks were pushed out by the Carthaginians. Overall, the Iberians were good at learning from others, but they didn't often develop their own styles once outside influences were gone. Spain's cultural history, even during medieval and Renaissance times, mostly reflects outside influence. The Greeks and Phoenicians, more focused on trade than conquest, mostly set up trading posts. Even rich cities like Gades took little surrounding land. Military conquest didn't begin until Hannibal's father tried to build a new empire in Spain after losing Sicily in the First Punic War. He kept taxes low, just half a tithe, but likely took over the valuable silver mines in the Sierra Morena. When Rome defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War, it took control of southern and eastern Spain, including the mines. When the historian Polybius visited, Roman mines in Spain employed 40,000 workers and produced silver worth about $2 million a year. Later, during Strabo's time, these mines were leased to private contractors, likely from the Roman upper class. Rome governed Spain in its usual way. Property rights were mostly respected. Only one Roman colony was founded at that time, Italica, created for retired and sick soldiers who couldn't return to Italy. The trade routes once controlled by Carthage were left open, and wealthy Phoenician merchants in Gades continued their business. Gades became a Roman ally, giving its merchants access to all Roman ports. In Augustus' time, the businessmen of Gades ran much of Spain's trade. Strabo said they built the largest trading ships for both the Mediterranean and Atlantic. He also noted that few citizens remained in Gades, as most were either trading overseas or enjoying life in Rome. Gades and Padua were the only cities outside Rome with so many citizens wealthy enough to qualify as knights. Strabo's observations show how little the Roman Republic focused on business opportunities in its provinces. At the same time, Rome kept fighting the rough tribes of central Spain. For about 100 years, there were waves of guerrilla resistance. Still, Roman leaders kept pushing forward, partly because they wanted formal treaties, and partly because governors hoped for military fame and riches. Nowhere else did the Senate's government show more clearly its focus on outdated traditions rather than real commercial potential. By the time Augustus came to power, Baetica had become thoroughly Romanized. This was mostly because of Caesar's actions in 45 to 44 BC, not because of much effort by the earlier Republican government. During the Republic, the only Roman colony in Baetica had been established in Cordova in 152 BC by Marcellus, meant to serve as the governor's base. While the town stayed partly Iberian, the Roman soldiers stationed there helped spread Latin language and culture to the local people. The southern part of Spain had been influenced by foreigners for so long that the local language and traditions were already fading. The elite of Gades, for example, were heavily involved in trade with Rome and had adopted many Roman customs. Although there were Roman settlers buying land, we don't often hear about them. Caesar accelerated this process, but not with a clear long-term plan. When he came to Spain in 45 BC to defeat Pompey's sons, he found that many cities in Baetica had supported his enemies. Some did this because of loyalty to Pompey's father, others because Caesar's own governor had mistreated them. Caesar needed land for his veterans and freedmen from the city, so he took over land from towns that had resisted him. Many of these were in the fertile Guadalquivir Valley. He settled veterans in Hispalis, which could be reached by sea during high tide. The city has remained a wealthy farming and trade center ever since. He also sent freedmen to form a charity colony in Urso. Other colonies were founded at Ucubi, Itaqui, and Hasta. Some cities that helped him received Latin rights as a reward. These settlements explain the strong Roman influence that the writer Strabo later described. The situation was different in the closer province of Spain. Here, only the coastal cities and some tribes along the Ebro River had been somewhat Romanized. When Caesar marched into this area in 49 BC to fight Pompey's forces near Ilerda, the nearby tribes had to choose sides. Many chose Caesar. Soon after, they were rewarded with Latin or Roman citizenship, even though they weren't ready for city life, because Caesar wanted to repay loyalty. Pliny's list of cities from Augustus' time shows that many places along the Ebro Valley up to Burgos had been granted special privileges. Augustus later spent 3 years in Spain to finally bring the remaining independent tribes in the west and northwest under control. Once he succeeded, he created some military colonies, most notably at Saragossa, Bracara Augusta, and Emerita, which was made into a beautiful city by Agrippa. These places were connected by well-constructed military roads. Some friendly towns were also given Roman citizenship, but outside of Baetica, the eastern coast, and these new colonies, the native tribes continued living as they had before. Looking back at how Spain was handled, we can see that Caesar and Augustus didn't break from the Senate's earlier approach. The Senate's main goal had been to keep peace and collect taxes, and they had left local society and economics largely unchanged. Roman generals granted citizenship as a personal reward to those who had supported them. Caesar and Augustus followed this same model, but they had more power and could act faster, especially since their wars gave them chances to take land and offer rewards. Grants of land, citizenship, and tax breaks sent a clear message. Loyalty paid off. Colonies built in areas that had opposed Rome were mostly military posts, located where roads met. These might help spread Roman culture, but there's no sign that the government encouraged people to learn Latin or adopt Roman city life. The long roads Augustus built, from Gaul along the coast to Gades, and inland routes like the one from Hispalis to Salamanca, were made mainly for military reasons. Though they also helped trade and led to new Roman towns, that was not their main goal. Strabo's detailed account shows that Spain, especially southern Spain, was doing well under Roman rule. Spanish ships, many owned by Punic merchants, were regularly bringing wine, oil, grain, linen, wool, metals, and salted meats and fish to Italian ports. The people were quickly adopting Roman customs. However, aside from a few major cities like Italica, Hispalis, Cordoba, Emerita, and Tarraco, this Romanization was only on the surface. The Iberians were, as before, copying foreign cultures without fully changing. Recent archaeological digs confirm this. It's also unlikely that either Caesar or Augustus paid much attention to cultural change, as the Roman government usually avoided interfering in local traditions and daily life. In Gaul, the Narbonese province was almost treated like a part of Italy. The region was very mixed. There were Iberians near the Pyrenees, Celts in the center, and Ligurians near the Alps. Because of this diversity, foreign influence entered easily. Marseille, a wealthy Greek trading colony, had already introduced the locals to foreign goods and customs. Rome had supported Marseille in exchange for help in wars and access to a road through their land to Spain. In 118 BC, after some efforts by the Gracchi, a Roman colony was founded at Narbo. Roman merchants and bankers settled there in large numbers. As Cisalpine Gaul became crowded, more Italians moved into this area. Some locals even studied literature, philosophy, and rhetoric in Marseille, and a few, like the poet Cornelius Gallus and Pompeius Trogus, went to Rome. During the Civil War, Caesar punished Marseille for supporting Pompey. He took some of its land and used it to found new colonies for veterans of his legions, one at Arelate, another at Baeterai, and another at Nimes. While Marseille kept its independence and traditional rights, Arles soon took over much of its trade because of its better location. Because of these changes, nearly all of the people in the Narbonese province gained Latin rights, except those in remote rural areas. These small villages were connected to larger cities for administrative purposes. For example, Nimes managed 24 nearby villages. After Caesar conquered the rest of Gaul, businessmen from the Narbonese province took advantage of new economic opportunities, making the region wealthy. The three more distant provinces of Gaul also experienced peace and fair rule under Augustus. Following Caesar's suggestions, Augustus drew clear provincial borders, sent good governors, and set fair taxes, which were collected honestly. When he divided the provinces, he combined 14 Celtic tribes with the Iberian Aquitanians and grouped some others with the Belgae. This may have been to prevent any one ethnic group from becoming too strong, or just to keep the provinces about the same size. Local political systems stayed the same. Each of the 64 tribes was governed by its own noble council, which elected a chief called a vergobret, or later a praetor. As Caesar had noted, power in Gaul was held by the landowners, while common people were nearly like serfs. This kind of tribal government did not attract many Romans to move in. Poor Romans didn't want to become peasants, and rich Romans didn't want the trouble of dealing with Celtic landlords and their unfamiliar ways of life. Since Caesar and Augustus didn't take land to build Roman-style cities, the central parts of Gaul remained mostly untouched by Roman culture for about a century. Today, when you visit French museums and look at artifacts from Roman-era cemeteries, you'll notice that Roman pottery there is often poor in quality and came much later, unlike the fine bronze pieces from the earlier pre-Roman Latin period. The Romanization of Gaul started slowly, beginning at the edges. It first spread from the Narbonese province and the area around Lyons in the south, and from the army camps along the Rhine in the north. There was some trade, of course. Gaul produced a lot of wool, enough to supply the Roman army and leave extra for merchants. Wine and oil were transported up the Rhone River, especially from the Narbonese area, since olives didn't grow well in central Gaul, and vineyards spread slowly to the north. Food and clothing for the Roman troops stationed on the Rhine were partly bought in the province and partly shipped through it. There was enough grain for local use and to feed the soldiers, but Gaul didn't export much wheat to Rome. The only major food items that Gaul sent to Rome were salt pork, made from pigs raised in oak forests, and a few types of cheese. In Caesar's time, iron was mined in Aquitania and southern Gaul, and local iron workshops served the region's needs. However, the fancy Roman-style country houses that archaeologists have found in Gaul belong to a later period. During Augustus's reign, and for a long time after, most of Gaul remained a land of Celtic nobles who enjoyed drinking, hunting, and mock battles, while the local farmers worked hard. Augustus didn't try to change this way of life, as long as the people paid taxes and kept the peace. Over time, the warlike local lords lost power, as peace replaced constant warfare. Augustus was not pleased that Julius Caesar had given Roman citizenship to many tribal leaders, and even allowed some of them into the Senate. Augustus avoided doing the same, either to stay on good terms with the Roman elite, or because he believed, after living 3 years in Gaul, that the Celts were not ready for Roman citizenship. There is no clear sign that Augustus wanted to turn villages into cities. When he moved the people of Bibracte from their hilltop town to the new city of Augustodunum in the valley, he likely did so to destroy a military stronghold, not to promote urban life. Some have criticized Augustus for ignoring Gaul's development, but his hands-off approach actually helped Gaul become Roman more naturally. If later emperors had followed his honest style of governing and respect for local customs, Roman Gaul might have become a stronger part of the empire during times of crisis. In the province of Asia, Julius Caesar had made a needed change by ending the abusive tax collection system and setting fair annual payments for each city at 2/3 of the usual amount. But the civil war that followed caused great suffering. In 43 BCE, the Senate allowed Brutus and Cassius to demand a large forced loan from the province to support their army. The amount was 10 times the yearly tax, which meant giving up a whole year's harvest in just 2 years. The Senate promised to repay the loan with interest, but only if it won the war. The cities objected, but they had no choice. Brutus and Cassius had armies nearby and wouldn't accept delays. The worst happened. The Senate lost the war. Mark Antony took control of the eastern provinces and punished the region for supporting Brutus and Cassius. He demanded the same huge payment again, this time not as a loan, but as a fine. We don't have full records of how badly this hurt the local economy, but it likely caused many bankruptcies and forced people to sell their land. Roman investors probably didn't buy more property during this time, as Roman citizens in Asia suffered just like the locals. Wealthy Italians were also hurt by the political chaos and preferred to buy land closer to home if they had the money to invest. Some inscriptions show that a few imperial estates in Asia may have been created during this troubled time. Some historians believe that land in Asia that used to pay taxes had become state-owned land, ager publicus, during the Republic, and that Augustus claimed it as imperial property. But this idea doesn't fit with Augustus' behavior in other parts of the empire. First, there's no evidence that the Senate had changed tax-paying land into public land. Second, although Augustus, like Caesar, used state money freely at first, he later kept clear financial records. When he and the Senate divided control of the provinces in 23 BCE, the accounts were handled properly. Normally, both public land and tax-paying land were managed by the state treasury, not by the emperor's private funds. The imperial estates in Asia were likely small during Augustus's time and may have come from the properties of proscribed senators and knights. Antony, who was less careful than Augustus, may have taken these lands for himself while he controlled the East for 10 years. The native people were allowed to keep their land unless they had lost it due to debt. Still, they had suffered badly, since both Antony and Brutus had taken nearly 2 full harvests from them. Fortunately, a long period of peace followed, with taxes collected more fairly and at lower rates. As a result, the region slowly returned to a moderate level of prosperity. During Augustus' rule, the province of Asia was mostly made up of small local economies. There were no major centers of wealth, few slaves, and little factory-style production. Most people lived in small villages in the countryside. They produced enough food for themselves and for nearby coastal cities, but not much extra. Men farmed small plots of land or raised sheep, while women and children made cloth, carpets, and decorative fabrics. These people were skilled in using old artistic designs and were experts in dyeing. The traditional rugs and embroideries of Anatolia go back many generations. Ephesus and the cities on the southern trade routes, Tralles and Apamea, were doing well. Tralles and Apamea were important for road trade, while Ephesus also did well through sea trade. The main road from Smyrna passed through Sardes and reached good sheep-raising lands and the marble quarries of Synoda, whose marble Augustus used in Rome. The ships from coastal cities made good profits, and Anatolian merchants traded across many seas. However, the great wealth that had existed when Alexander opened the East and continued while Rome used slaves from local tribes had declined by this time. Peace and the rise of the Western Empire had changed everything. To the east of the province of Asia was Galatia, which became a Roman imperial province in 25 BCE, after King Amyntas died in battle and left his entire kingdom to Augustus. This area included large imperial estates, lands owned by temples, and Roman colonies, making it stand out in terms of economic history. There has been confusion because some unique institutions of Galatia have been wrongly connected to the province of Asia, so it's important to clarify this. The Galatians were Celtic tribes who settled around Ancyra in the 3rd century BCE. After Amyntas, a commander of Galatian cavalry, switched sides to support the triumvirs at the Battle of Philippi, he was rewarded by being made king of his people. He also received the regions of Lycaonia, Pisidia, southern Phrygia, and Isauria, expanding his rule south to the Taurus Mountains. The Galatian rulers likely owned large areas of land for raising animals, and Amyntas seems to have taken control of all of them. According to the geographer Strabo, Amyntas had about 300 herds of animals in the plains of Lycaonia alone. The people living between Old Galatia and the Taurus Mountains were from various small temple communities, where priests held both religious and political power. Augustus claimed these temple lands as royal property when he took over the kingdom in 25 BCE. This may be because Amyntas had already treated them as his personal land. Normally, Augustus did not take temple lands, so this idea helps explain why he took control here. It also explains why large imperial estates appeared early in places like southern Phrygia and Pisidia, while in the older province of Asia, government-owned land was rare before the widespread confiscations under the Severan emperors. The colonies that Augustus established on this new land were also quite unusual. In 25 BCE, he founded a colony at Pisidian Antioch, made up of retired soldiers from the 5th Gallic Legion. He likely thought these veterans would feel more at home near the Galatian region. Augustus appears to have used temple lands freely to divide up plots for the settlers. The colony had a military purpose. Amyntas had died trying to stop a raid by the wild mountain tribe called the Romanization. A few years later, Augustus decided to finish that conflict and sent his general to attack the tribe from both the north and south. This campaign, led by Quirinius, the same governor mentioned in the Bible, ended successfully by 6 BCE. After that, Augustus established several new colonies along the base of the Taurus Mountains, from Olbassa to Lystra, to permanently protect the region's plains. The settlers were likely veterans, and some captured members of local tribes. The land came partly from territory taken during the war, and partly from earlier conquests by Murena and Amyntas. From then on, this area remained peaceful. However, it would be wrong to think that the many different peoples of the Galatian provinces ever formed a strong cultural or economic unit. Augustus seemed unconcerned with whether they became truly Roman. This is clear from the fact that he settled Gallic people there instead of Italians. The results of this can be seen in the inscriptions found in the area. The 6 colonies established in 6 BCE were quickly absorbed into the mixed culture of Anatolia. As a result, Latin inscriptions are rare, and in Antioch, Greek soon became the dominant language. In the main part of Galatia, no real effort was made to Romanize the locals, except for building a temple to Rome and Augustus, and starting a shared worship practice. But even that didn't last long. The final recorded meeting of the local assembly was in 101 CE. Later on, even though the Celtic language remained for a while, Greek eventually became the main language of the region. Egypt is probably the most well-known of all Roman provinces. Its unique economy, shown through thousands of ancient documents called papyri, has been widely studied. Its influence on the rest of the Roman Empire is often mentioned. But Egypt was the least Roman of all provinces, and should be studied separately. Otherwise, because there is so much information, we might mistakenly think Egypt was a typical Roman province. It's important to note that wages in Egypt were much lower, only about 1/3 of what workers earned elsewhere. Food was also cheaper. Egypt had its own weak currency, and its social structure was unlike that of any other province. When Augustus took Egypt after Cleopatra's death and made it a Roman province, he cut it off from the rest of the empire, not just to control its wealth, but because its systems were so different from those in Italy that he didn't want Romans becoming too involved there. To understand Egypt's unusual system, we need to look at its background. Nature itself shaped Egypt's society. Until the 1800s, when the Nile River was finally brought under control, the people had no choice but to live under a strong central government. Individual freedom didn't fit in Egypt, and hadn't for thousands of years. The yearly Nile flood in September was the main source of life, and as the population grew, people had to build canals and dikes to spread the water far across the land. Ordinary people, or small villages, couldn't handle such huge tasks. Since the land stretched over 1,000 miles, the system had to be managed on a national level. Only a king, who was also seen as a god, had the power and authority to do this. So even in ancient times, the king owned all of Egypt, and the people were like tenants who worked his land and worshipped him. During the time when Persia ruled Egypt, and before Alexander the Great and Ptolemy Soter took control, much of the land had fallen into the hands of temples or private owners. Other areas became useless because the canals weren't maintained. Ptolemy Soter and his son, Philadelphus, started by accepting this situation, but they soon began restoring the land and bringing more organization to the government. To keep the loyalty of the farmers, they took on the title of Egyptian gods, like the earlier pharaohs, but they never intended to become Egyptian themselves. Instead, they built Alexandria as a separate Greek city and brought in many Greeks to help them manage the country. They improved the tax system and repaired the canals, making new land usable. This land was given to Greek and Asian soldiers so they could farm when not fighting in wars. They especially improved the Fayum region, a fertile basin, by draining swampy areas and building better canals at higher levels. This allowed even more land to be farmed. They also took back land that temples had claimed and brought temple taxes under state control. They found smart ways to manage and sell the goods they collected as taxes and rent. By controlling the sale of these goods, they could avoid competition and make extra profit. For example, they controlled the production and sale of oil from sesame and other plants, beer from barley, and even papyrus paper. In some cases, they built government-run factories. Over time, this state control grew so much that even banking and some parts of shipping were run by the government. Egypt, for a while, became not just a royal estate, but also a giant state-run business. It is hard to find any other example in history where so many people were managed by a small group of rulers and their administrators, like under the early Ptolemies. To understand how Augustus ran Egypt, we need to look at some details of the earlier Ptolemaic system. These details come from documents like the revenue laws of Philadelphus and letters from the king's officials. As mentioned before, the king owned huge areas of land. In one village, even though much land had been given to soldiers, at least half still belonged to the king. Farmers who worked this land paid regular taxes and also gave about 1/3 of their crops as rent. The land that the king didn't officially own was still labeled exempted land, which hinted that he could claim it if he wanted to. This included temple-owned land, certain areas that had never been claimed by earlier rulers, and also land given by kings to soldiers, to officers, or to top officials. The income from these lands often served as payment instead of a salary. The smaller plots were likely meant to stay in the family if the owner's sons could take over their father's role in the army. The larger estates, however, were probably only given for the time of service. All of this land still paid taxes to the king. On grain fields, the tax was usually around 1.5 bushels per acre. Since Egyptian wheat fields produced about 25 bushels per acre, this was actually less than 10%, and it was often seen as the cost of the seed. Taxes were collected in crops for grain and oil lands, but for vineyards, fruit trees, and gardens, taxes were paid in money. Since wine-producing land earned more than grain land, it brought in more tax revenue. On average, wine land paid about 50 drachmas per arura, plus an additional temple tax and a land use tax. Landowners also had to work about 5 days a year on canal maintenance, or pay a fee instead. Still, farmers weren't the only ones paying for government costs. All native Egyptians had to pay a poll tax. There was also a small house tax, though it didn't bring in much money since Egyptian houses made of mud brick were cheap. People in villages who had jobs or ran shops had to pay a work tax, ranging from small amounts to about $50 per year, depending on the trade. In some cases, this tax came in the form of a payment to get exclusive rights to sell or produce certain items in a village. This was awarded to the highest bidder. These trade rights, similar to modern-day salt or tobacco monopolies, played a big role in production and sales. A section of the revenue law explains in detail how the government controlled oil production. The government decided how much oil was needed for the year, told farmers how much land to plant, and gave them seeds. The state then took part of the harvest as tax and bought the rest at fixed prices. For example, in 258 BCE, the price the state paid was 5 cents per quart of sesame oil and half that for castor oil. Farmers were not allowed to keep any oil. They had to sell all of it to the state. Each village had to set up a facility for making oil from seeds. Private contractors, who bought the production rights, processed the oil and paid fixed wages to workers. These workers had to make a set amount of oil daily. The oil was then sold to local merchants who had bought the right to sell it in their villages. These merchants also had to sell the oil at a fixed price, 25 cents per quart, in 258 BCE. To stop competition, imported oil was taxed heavily, with a 50% import duty. The king made about 25% profit from this system, on top of the taxes he collected. Other similar monopolies existed for goods like salt, papyrus, beer, linen, jewelry, perfumes, bricks, and more. Thanks to the letters of Zenon, a manager working for the king's steward Philadelphus, we now know more about how the king encouraged farming. Instead of giving Apollonius, his chief steward, a salary, the king allowed him to collect income from a large estate of 10,000 auroras in newly reclaimed land in the Fayum region. The king sent an engineer to extend the irrigation canal farther north so that more land could be watered and part of a nearby lake could be drained. Apollonius's estate was located near this new canal and would benefit from the water. We even have the engineer's original. On part of his land, Apollonius had to reserve certain plots for soldiers. These were for the king's use, so Apollonius received no benefit from them. On another part, he tried to bring in farmers from the Nile Delta to settle there. He rented out one section to a group of local farmers, who finally agreed, after much debate, to pay 1/3 of their crop as rent. He leased several large farms to skilled Egyptian farmers, who brought in laborers, including some Arabian shepherds. On much of the land, he planted vines, olive trees, and fruit trees, likely because the king requested it. One day, the king ordered him to try growing 2 crops a year. This meant planting a fast-growing crop in August or September, right when irrigation water was available, and harvesting it early enough to plant a second crop in the winter before the Nile's waters dropped. Historians think that a fast-growing type of wheat, called 3-month wheat, was used for the second crop. Once the estate was fully functioning, the king personally came to inspect it. This strong personal interest suggests the king viewed the land as an experimental site, not permanent property. In fact, Apollonius lost the land when he was dismissed after the king's death, and the land, except for the soldiers' parts, probably returned to royal control. The king's wide range of projects helps explain how he was able to collect over 15,000 talents a year in revenue, more than all of Rome's income in Cicero's time. Today, Egypt's national budget is over £35 million, about 10 times as much. But back then, wheat was worth only 1/5 of what it is today. This was the province Augustus inherited when Cleopatra died, at least in theory. In reality, a century of poor management had caused serious decline. The later Ptolemies were not good rulers. Cleopatra's father was famous for his large debts, and Cleopatra herself, although remarkable in other ways, was not a strong administrator. To stay popular, they had been too generous with land grants and special privileges. As a result, temples and private landowners gained more land, and the royal estate shrank. Land originally given to soldiers or officers temporarily had become permanent private property. When the canals were neglected and filled with silt, farmland was abandoned, and many state-run industries broke down into private monopolies full of corruption. The old tax system remained on paper, but no longer matched the reality, since much land had changed hands or status. Some lands marked as free had ended up with local Egyptians after intermarriage with Greek settlers. When Augustus took over, he followed standard Roman policy. He left land ownership and taxes as he found them, without checking if they were still fair or justified. Where he found royal land, though it was now much less, he treated it as Roman state property and charged full rent. Where he found private land, he accepted it as such and collected taxes based on past rules, even if the land no longer matched its official category. He could have argued that lands once given to Greek and Eastern soldiers should no longer be tax-exempt, since the Ptolemaic army no longer existed. But he didn't. Nor did he question how certain Egyptians came to own privileged land. He did, however, continue the Roman custom of keeping a social distinction between Greeks and native Egyptians. In a way, Augustus' decision made sense, since land values had already adjusted to match their tax obligations and benefits. Instead of changing everything, he ordered a new population and land survey, a census, to be taken every 14 years, so that taxes could be collected more fairly based on the land's size and quality. He only changed ownership when circumstances required it. For example, he took over Cleopatra's palaces and gardens for the state, and likely took over properties Antony had held in Egypt. Some of Antony's family who remained loyal may have kept their lands, but many of Cleopatra's soldiers and officials who died at the Battle of Actium lost their lands, which Augustus probably gave to victorious Roman generals and officials. This would explain why, later, people like Maecenas, Agrippa, and even Livia and her sons owned land in Egypt, especially in the Fayum, which had been full of soldier settlements. Roman custom allowed military leaders to take war spoils for themselves and reward their followers. Since Augustus gave all Roman citizens a bonus of 400 sesterces and granted land to his soldiers, it's likely that he rewarded his officers generously too. However, he probably didn't break tradition when it came to older, income-producing lands. He likely registered them as Roman property and sent their goods to Rome. One other major change Augustus made was more unusual, but still aligned with Roman policy. He took most temple lands away from religious control and gave state-paid pensions to support temple services instead. This was partly for political reasons and partly to prevent religious leaders from having too much control over the population. Rome's usual policy was to keep religion under state control and avoid giving priests too much power through land ownership. This reform also helped balance things, since some temples had too much land while others had too little. From then on, all temples received a fair yearly payment. However, not all religious privileges were taken away. Temples were still allowed to make fine linen robes for priests and continue making papyrus, which they used in large amounts. Taxes in Egypt had become disorganized and outdated, but Augustus mostly kept them as they were, changing only a few things. However, he made sure they were collected strictly and used simpler methods for collection. The grain tax from the Ptolemaic period remained the same, about 1.5 bushels per acre from a typical yield of 25 bushels. Vineyards still paid around 50 drachmas per aurora, plus the old temple tax, and another unclear tax called the eparura, adding about 6 drachmas more. This made the total about 66 drachmas per aurora. But because the drachma had lost much of its silver value, the real tax burden was lighter than before, even though wine prices had also dropped. Since vineyards in Egypt could produce about 500 gallons of wine per acre, and wine sold for around 0.75 drachma per gallon, the tax was roughly 1/6 of the total income, matching ancient customs. Other fruit land paid fewer taxes, only the temple tax and eparura, and even these were collected in weakened currency. The required yearly labor on canals, which remained essential, also continued. To collect both money and crop-based taxes, Augustus followed Roman tradition and Caesar's earlier reforms in Asia by ending the old contract system used in Egypt. This also meant ending many monopolies created by the Ptolemies. Instead of tax farming, the Roman method was to make communities responsible for paying fixed amounts. In Egypt, however, fixed payments were not practical. Nobody could predict the Nile's flooding from year to year, and Egyptian villages didn't have local governments like Roman towns. So, a compromise was made. Each village had to send a list of reliable landowners to the Roman prefect, who would pick a group of tax collectors to serve for 3 years. This position, like a Roman city official's role, was supposed to be an honor and unpaid. But for Egyptians, used to being forced into service, it probably felt more like a burden. Over time, this job became very unpopular. Still, while the government was fair, there weren't many complaints. Non-farming Egyptians also had to pay taxes. Adult males had to pay a poll tax, around 16 drachmas in the weakened currency, unless they were Roman citizens or from one of the 3 Greek cities, who were exempt. People in trades or shops paid a license fee instead of bidding for business rights, as they did in the Ptolemaic era. Records from the Fayum show that oil sellers and bakers paid 96 drachmas a year for a license, while fullers and beer sellers paid twice as much. These prices were fixed, not auctioned. Another old tax was crown gold, which meant giving money or gifts to the king. Philadelphus had once collected over $2 million worth of gifts during a festival. A newly found letter shows how serious this was. "The king demands the crown gifts again. Do what you must quickly. The gifts must arrive in Alexandria in 3 days. Also send our gift for the king's birthday." Augustus and Tiberius did not follow this practice, but Caligula brought it back. In the 3rd century, as emperors came and went, this gift tax became one of the heaviest burdens in Egypt. As for trade taxes, customs duties were reduced. Rome didn't support monopolies in Egypt and never liked protective taxes. Besides, Egypt produced so much and had such low prices that foreign goods rarely competed there. With trade now open, Egypt became a transit route for goods coming from Arabia and India on their way to Rome. There were few major political or social changes. Augustus dissolved the Ptolemaic army and stationed 2 or 3 Roman legions in a camp near Alexandria. The province was ruled by a Roman knight, not a senator, and no senator could enter Egypt without Augustus's permission. He saw Egypt more as a business operation than a political problem. The people were too submissive to cause serious uprisings. Senators were kept out to avoid political plots and to make sure the knight governor wasn't overshadowed by higher-ranking Romans. The first governor, Cornelius Gallus, stopped a small revolt in central Egypt and secured the southern border against attacks from Nubia. The second, Aelius Gallus, tried, without enough information, to add the Arabian coast, including the area around Mecca, to the province. This area was believed to be rich, known to Romans because of the caravans bringing spices, perfumes, pearls, and precious stones from Arabia and India to the ports of Palestine. Aelius Gallus didn't achieve any long-term conquests, but his expedition still brought valuable knowledge about trade routes. Thanks to what the Romans learned, they reopened the old trade route through Egypt. They improved the road from Myos Hormos on the Red Sea to Koptos on the Nile by building water storage tanks at desert stops and placing guards along the route to protect traders. A special tax was collected at Koptos to fund the stations and security. Greek merchants quickly saw the benefits of this safer, easier route, and soon trade from Arabia and India started arriving at Myos Hormos, crossing to the Nile, then continuing to Alexandria and finally Rome. Strabo noted, "Since the Romans recently invaded Arabia Felix under my friend Aelius Gallus, and merchants now sail from Alexandria to India, these regions are far better known than before. When I traveled with Gallus up the Nile to Syene, I learned that 120 ships were sailing from Myos Hormos to India, whereas during the Ptolemaic era, only a few had tried that journey." The third Roman governor, Petronius, did something even more important for Egypt. Under the early Ptolemies, Egypt's canal system had been greatly expanded and supported a system where dry lands could grow 2 crops a year, often producing more than areas flooded by the Nile, as long as the canals were kept clean. But by Augustus's time, the canals had been neglected. Petronius ordered the army to clean them, and afterwards the local farmers were made responsible for keeping them clear. This effort restored large amounts of farmland that had been abandoned. Strabo wrote that a 12-cubit rise in the Nile now produced the same effect as a 14-cubit rise had in the past, meaning thousands of acres had returned to use. Modern excavations at the villages of Caranus and Philadelphia in the Fayum show that these communities regained the prosperity and housing density they had enjoyed 2 centuries earlier, but lost during the decline under the last Ptolemies. These achievements show that Augustus began to understand that government could do more than just rule. It could also actively improve the economy. However, Augustus didn't plan to offer much more social support beyond what affected the treasury. A recently discovered summary of the rules from the Idios Logos, the office in charge of special taxes, shows that Augustus mostly accepted old social customs and didn't try to change the caste system left by the Greeks. There was no indication that native Egyptians could gain Roman or even Alexandrian citizenship, or gain the self-government that Spanish and Gallic tribes enjoyed. Rules like requiring people to register in their hometowns during the 14-year census, or needing a permit to leave Egypt, show that local people didn't have full freedom of movement. While this might not have mattered much, it clearly reflects Rome's policy to leave the local social structure unchanged. It's worth asking whether ending the Ptolemaic monopoly system improved the economy. We know that wages increased, but it's hard to say if this meant better living conditions. Even though we can measure how much silver was in the coins, we don't know how stable the coins were in value, or how an artificial exchange rate with Roman money might have affected their worth. Since few Roman coins, denarii, circulated in Egypt, it's safest to assume that Egyptian coins were usually worth only the silver they contained. Also, when comparing wages to wheat prices, we aren't fully sure that the Egyptian unit of grain, the artaba, always equaled 29.1 liters as commonly assumed. The silver drachma in the 3rd century BCE had about 3.6 grams of silver, similar to the Roman denarius under Nero, which was worth about 20 US cents in gold. But by Cleopatra's time, the Egyptian drachma had lost much of its value, often worth less than half its stated amount. When Tiberius introduced a stable currency in Egypt, he based it on 4 drachma coins, which only contained about 25% silver. These coins were likely treated as equal to the Roman denarius, with 1 drachma equal to 1 sestertius. But such exchanges were rare. Egypt mostly used its own money system. So, when we see that wages in Roman Egypt were 4 times higher than in early Ptolemaic times, we must remember that the coins paid were only worth 1/4 as much as before. The actual amount of silver people received hadn't increased. These tetradrachmas kept the Tiberian standard until about the reign of Septimius Severus. After that, the coins lost more value, though not as fast as Roman denarii. They eventually lost about half their worth, but stayed at that level until Emperor Aurelian. During Rome's late period of chaos, the coin became almost worthless, just bronze with a thin silver coating. Later, under Diocletian's reforms, Egypt's separate coinage was abolished, and the standard Roman coins, the aureus and denarius, were introduced. It should be clear that Egyptian coins cannot be used as a reliable measure for comparing wages and prices. Instead, they are only useful as a shared reference point when we happen to have wage and grain price data from the same time period. But we also need to remember that wheat likely increased in value compared to other goods, since so much of Egypt's wheat was sent as tribute to Rome that there probably wasn't much left over. The following examples, taken from the records compiled by West and Segre, reflect typical figures. The artaba of wheat is considered to be about 29.11 liters, roughly 4/5 of a British bushel. The wages shown are for unskilled workers. When looking at these numbers, it's reasonable to question the accuracy of the wheat prices listed for 79 AD and 190 AD, since both are unusually high. Egypt often experienced food shortages where prices would rise sharply for a short time, but wages wouldn't necessarily go up during such brief periods. Also, some wheat prices are from spring or summer, when prices were naturally higher than at harvest time. Still, the data generally supports the conclusion that wages increased over time, though very slowly when measured against wheat. In fact, wages seem to have doubled in Egypt across the 500-year span being studied. When we also look at the changing prices of wine and oil, it seems clear that wheat became more valuable compared to other goods. This means that, in terms of what else they could buy, Egyptian workers were earning better pay. Of course, we are less confident in our understanding of liquid measurements than dry ones, and prices for wine and oil could vary a lot depending on quality. So it's hard to define a clear average. Back in the 3rd century BC, when winemaking in Egypt was still new, wine was expensive. At that time, 40 liters of wine could buy 4 artabas of wheat. During the late Ptolemaic period, the same amount of wine bought only 2 artabas, and during the early Roman Empire, only 1. This low exchange rate continued into the 3rd century AD, when it rose again to 2. As for oil, 40 liters could buy about 24 artibus of wheat in the mid-3rd century BC. By the later Ptolemies, it dropped to 10, during the early empire to 8, and rose slightly to 10 again by around 240–255 AD. Of course, we can't be completely sure that wine and oil prices reflect all goods in the economy. But based on the evidence we do have, it seems likely that Rome's heavy use of Egyptian wheat reduced the local supply and kept its price higher than that of other products. So, if we see that wages improved steadily in terms of wheat, we can probably assume that, once more evidence is available, wages in Roman Egypt more than doubled when measured in terms of a wider range of goods. At the start of the Ptolemaic period, there was a major need for economic adjustment. Back then, wages in Egypt were only about 1/3 of what workers earned in Greece, while wheat prices in Egypt were about half of what they were at Delos. Under these conditions, the royal monopolies made huge profits, both from natural resources and from goods they produced and exported. We don't know much about wages in Italy, since slave labor was so common, but we do know that during the time of Cicero, and later under Nero, wheat sold for nearly twice the price in Italy as it did in Egypt. By the year 301, Emperor Diocletian was able to set the same prices and wages in Egypt as in the rest of the Roman Empire. This shows that Egypt had mostly caught up with the broader Roman economy. If Augustus had continued the Ptolemaic system of strict monopolies, this kind of economic adjustment probably wouldn't have happened. One reason wages in Egypt rose gradually may have been that native Egyptians were slowly freed from the movement restrictions of the Ptolemaic period. According to Strabo, merchants from Alexandria took control of most of the trade with the East that had opened up thanks to Aelius Gallus's efforts. This trade grew quickly. We also know that products from Alexandria, such as glassware, papyrus, jewelry, and linen, were in high demand across the Roman world. This growth in free trade and industry likely attracted many Egyptians from the countryside and created a more active job market. In addition, Rome eventually recruited 2 full legions from Egypt, providing military jobs for thousands of locals. Still, we shouldn't imagine that the poor mud brick villages of Egyptian farmers suddenly became grand cities of stone. Archaeological evidence shows that the villages didn't change much in appearance, though they were no longer falling apart as they had been in the last century of the Ptolemies. The well-made Roman-era tomb portraits found at Hawara, which show people who look well off, actually belong to Greeks, not Egyptians. A census from Philadelphia in the 2nd century AD shows that although many small plots of land were owned by Egyptians, more than half of the land belonged to outsiders, people from Alexandria and Rome, even though they made up only 1/10 of the total landowners. Another record from the same time lists 6,475 Greeks living in the Fayum region. These people were the wealthy and socially privileged class. Naturally, there were complaints of unfair treatment. Taxes were high. Since the canal system had already been built before the Romans arrived and was now maintained by the local people, there was no real reason to keep tax rates so high, except for the weak excuse that they had always been that way. Alexandrian Greeks were especially unhappy because their rulers were no longer fellow Greeks. Egyptians didn't have any major complaints at first, except that Roman officials collected taxes with more discipline and strictness. These protests shouldn't be taken too seriously when judging how well the Roman government managed the province. After all, today people often flood tax offices with complaints after every new assessment. Yet that doesn't mean the system itself is a failure. With that in mind, we can say that Augustus's rule was generally beneficial for Egypt, but his reforms were limited and cautious. He didn't have a broad plan to improve life for the people. Instead, he mostly followed the old ideals of the Roman Republic: maintain law and order, avoid interfering too much in daily life, respect local customs as long as people stayed peaceful, and collect taxes fairly and completely. After reviewing some typical provinces during Augustus' rule, we can make a few general observations. Augustus was much less involved in economic issues than Julius Caesar had been. The job of building and managing the new Roman government was already huge, enough for one lifetime. Augustus had inherited a system where dictatorship had destroyed the old republic, and he had to create a government that respected old Roman traditions enough to satisfy conservatives while also being strong enough to unite many very different provinces. This work took up all his time. He only paid attention to economic and social matters when they were directly linked to political needs. Outside of Egypt, Augustus didn't try to make big changes to improve industry or trade. Even in Egypt, his actions, like lowering trade taxes and reducing monopolies, were just meant to introduce standard Roman trade practices. He wasn't interested in expanding trade or reforming land ownership, as Caesar had been. Also, he avoided touching property rights. Although he had been involved in land confiscations during the time of the triumvirs, after becoming emperor, he stayed away from such actions. After the Battle of Actium, he rewarded his soldiers with land, but this land was bought using public funds. His colonies were placed carefully, but mainly for military and political reasons, not for economic development. He didn't get involved in changing the daily lives or cultures of the provincial people either. There's no clear sign that Augustus had any strong plan to Romanize or urbanize the local populations, even though some historians have claimed that. He simply made sure that every part of the empire had a local group or tribe that could keep peace and collect taxes. When that wasn't possible, like in Egypt, he found other ways to maintain control. But once order was in place, he let communities live as they wished. In fact, his approach was one of total hands-off economics and society, a strong example of laissez-faire. This hands-off approach may have actually helped Romanization. Peace under Augustus gave people the chance to develop if they wanted to. Economic success brought satisfaction with Roman rule, and this made people more open to Roman ways. As people grew wealthier, they could enjoy the benefits of city life, and those who wanted this lifestyle moved to towns. It's true that many new cities were founded during Augustus's time, but this wasn't part of a big plan. It just happened naturally because of peace and stability. There was some growth in trade and industry during Augustus' rule. The earlier chapters on large-scale production and trade gave examples from this peaceful time, when travel was safer. But this period didn't see major inventions or new types of business organization. Progress was clear, but limited. Slavery and the Roman upper class's negative attitude toward business still made it hard for economic growth to reach its full potential. People in the provinces benefited more than those in Italy, but even then, they mostly kept working in the same types of industries they had known before. The economic history of the Roman Empire between the reigns of Augustus and Hadrien is complex. During this time, the empire was peaceful and spread across much of the known world. Trade by sea was safe, and well-maintained military roads crossed the provinces. There were no high tariffs or strict laws to block business growth, and the government didn't interfere with economic activity, either to help or to hinder. People everywhere were free to use their resources and prove their skills. By the end of the century, most regions were doing well financially. This growing wealth was visible in the grand public buildings and luxurious homes, especially during Hadrian's rule. Italy also experienced prosperity, though it wasn't spread evenly, so we need to look at specific regions before making general conclusions. In 33 AD, Italy faced a strange real estate crisis. Historians often see this as a sign of economic trouble. Tacitus wrote that moneylenders were charging illegal interest rates, and were ordered to lower them and invest 2/3 of their capital in Italian land within 18 months. High interest rates usually signal tough times when people are losing their properties. The Senate's order likely meant many landowners were forced to sell their land cheaply. But this problem might have been caused by short-term issues, like a few years of bad weather. Unfortunately, the Senate's solution made things worse. Lenders rushed to collect their loans, which led to panic selling of land and falling prices. To stop the crisis, the emperor created land banks and offered interest-free loans to farmers for 3 years. Since $5 million was enough to stop the panic, the problem probably wasn't very deep. It would be wrong to assume this one event reflected the entire condition of farming in Italy. The crisis seems to have been short-lived and made worse by poor decisions. Looking at different areas of Italy shows that the land was mostly in good shape. In the south, though, the old Greek cities remained quiet and inactive. They had once thrived under Roman protection during the Gracchian era, but once all Mediterranean ports had equal trade rights, their advantage disappeared. Their farming met local needs, and Pliny mentioned that they still exported some wine. The nearby inland areas, like Calabria and Apulia, were used as pasture land by rich Roman landowners who used slave labor. In fact, in 24 AD, there was a serious risk of a slave revolt among these herdsmen, and later, a noblewoman named Domitia was executed for letting slaves on her estates become a public danger. In Campania, things changed. The port of Puteoli, once Italy's top commercial hub during the Republic, had developed industries that supported nearby cities like Capua. But now it was facing tough competition from the port of Ostia, where Emperor Claudius had built a large new harbor. Fewer ships came to Puteoli. A letter from a dock manager in Puteoli in the 2nd century complains about falling profits. The problem wasn't just Ostia. Local industries in Puteoli and Capua were declining, so traders couldn't count on getting cargo for their return trips. In the past, soldiers had to buy their own gear in Italy before going to war, helping local businesses. But now, the army stayed near the borders and got equipment from local factories. Pottery from Campania now faced competition from products made in Gaul. Capua's metal goods and its once thriving perfume trade lost ground to imports from Arabia and Alexandria. Still, we shouldn't think all of Campania was in decline. While factory owners had made good money, they mostly used slave workers, so free people didn't benefit much. The region's long-term wealth came from its rich volcanic soil, mild climate, and steady water supply, which allowed farming year-round. Campanian wine remained very popular in Rome and sold well to wealthy Romans who had villas along the coast. The area was full of vineyards and orchards, and between them, farmers grew vegetables all year. On the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, water was scarcer, so tightly packed vineyards and orchards were grown instead of grain. Many villas have been uncovered in this region. Some were elegant homes where the landowners lived, like the well-decorated villa at Bosco Reale. Others were simple farmhouses meant for the steward and slaves, with no signs that the owner lived there. Most inland villas show signs of wine production run with slave labor. The owners were likely members of the local elite from Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Naples, although there was also a large estate owned by Agrippa Postumus, a member of the Imperial family. We've already talked about Pompeii. During the Roman Empire, up until its destruction in 79 AD, Pompeii did fairly well, though its economy didn't change much. Wealthy people, likely mostly landowners, lived in nicely decorated houses that show signs of growing middle-class comfort. There's some evidence of trade in wine, wool, and fish, but most businesses still followed the small shop model. Excavations on the Via Abbondanza show that many old homes along this street were being turned into shops. But that's not unusual. This street led from a major city gate to the Forum, so heavy traffic would have made it less appealing for living. Some residents were also moving to country villas outside the city, since peace made it safer to live beyond the city walls. Overall, Pompeii and the surrounding area seemed to stay prosperous until the eruption. Some say the area was already in decline because Pompeii wasn't rebuilt afterward, but that overlooks the obvious. The land was buried under 30 feet of volcanic ash and couldn't be farmed anymore. In central West Italy, we don't hear much about big changes. Rome continued to grow as the home of the emperor, the aristocracy, and the people who benefited from the empire's wealth. But Rome's growth didn't do much for the surrounding region. The emperors brought in large amounts of grain as tax payments and sold it cheaply or gave it away to the poor, so the local farmers couldn't sell grain to the city. Still, Rome did need other farm products like wine, oil, meat, vegetables, and poultry, and likely bought all that the nearby land could produce. Rome didn't have factories, but there were many small shops, as proven by inscriptions. The city's economy, however, was unusual, chaotic, and unhealthy. The large households with dozens or hundreds of slaves, the frequent public games, and the free food given by emperors to win popularity brought in a lot of poor and unproductive people. When cruel emperors killed off wealthy noble families, their land often ended up in the hands of flatterers and freed slaves, disrupting the old system and hurting the economy beyond those directly affected. The countryside around Rome had changed. Villas became common along the coast from Civitavecchia to Antium and on the Alban and Sabine hills. These villas often had gardens and orchards, but they were more for show than for farming. Most of the flat land in the Campania was used for grazing animals during most of the year. Pliny wrote that when he rode to his villa at Pratica, he saw nothing but sheep herds until he reached the woods near the coast. When Emperor Nero founded a colony of retired soldiers in Antium, many of them soon sold their land and moved elsewhere, often to places they had seen during their service that seemed more fertile. Yet there were exceptions. Seneca had a productive vineyard at Nomentum, and Columella grew wine successfully at Albano, Ardea, and Cerveteri. Overall, we can imagine the Campania in Nero's time as much like it is today, but with more fancy villas on the hills and coast. Tuscany had already been in decline for a long time and didn't improve much during the empire. Its early wealth came from the Etruscans, who made use of the rich soil, metal mines, and trade helped by alliances with the Carthaginians. But by now, the soil was worn out, and erosion quickly ruined any gains from fertilizing the land. Trade had moved elsewhere, and the metal industry had faded after Spain became a new source. When Strabo visited the old iron town of Populonia, all he saw were piles of cold, abandoned slag. Even Aretine pottery, once famous across the Mediterranean during Augustus's reign, was losing popularity to cheaper copies made in Gaul. Perugia never fully recovered from the civil wars, and Florence, even after being resettled with army veterans, didn't grow much despite being in a fertile valley. In fact, there's not much mention of Tuscany in Roman records from this period. The only truly active town was Luna on the edge of Tuscany, which had marble quarries that shipped Carrara marble to Rome in large quantities. Writers like Columella and Pliny do mention Tuscan wine and wheat, but without much enthusiasm. It seems that most of the region was covered in farmland and pasture, though not especially profitable. The Romans who owned large estates in Tuscany probably rented them out to tenant farmers, as they did with distant grain-producing lands elsewhere. We don't have much detailed information about central Italy and its mountain regions. We know that large areas were used as summer pastures for animals that were moved down to the coast during the rest of the year. We also know that wealthy landowners gathered estates in the more fertile valleys, and used this land mostly for gardening and small-scale farming. But more than in other parts of Italy, the old system of small farms owned by working farmers still existed here. We have mortgage records from two areas, the hills near Beneventum and the lower slopes of the Apennines south of Piacenza, both from the early 2nd century. These records list the owners and their farms, many of which still carried names dating back to Augustus's census. From this, we learn that the original 89 farms around Beneventum had been reduced to 50 owners by the time of Emperor Trajan. Some owners had gained multiple farms. One owned 11, but 32 still owned just one farm each. None of the properties were extremely large. The most valuable farm was worth around $25,000. 12 farms were valued between $24,000 and $5,000. 17 between $5,000 and $2,500, and 20 between $2,500 and $700. There were likely smaller plots too, but they weren't listed because the interest from such small mortgages wasn't worth collecting. So even after some consolidation of land, we still don't see large estates in this region. We can't be sure of the land sizes, since land value depended heavily on quality. Vineyards in fertile valleys might be worth $200 per jugerum, while rocky mountain land might be almost worthless. If we assumed the land was average, worth about $100 per jugerum, then the farms would range in size from about 5 to 166 acres. But mountain pasture land was likely included, especially in the second record. The situation near Velea, south of Piacenza, was similar. After the first wave of land distribution, some landholdings were expanded, although we don't have exact numbers. Historian De Pactere studied one inscription and identified some of the farms, finding that the more valuable properties were in the mountains used for pasture and logging, while the fertile valley gardens were mostly owned by small farmers. If other records confirm this pattern, it would mean that much of the rough mountain land in Italy had not become part of large plantation estates by Trajan's time. It makes sense that wealthy landowners would control the forest and grazing land, since only they could afford to profit from such difficult properties. De Pactere also made another important observation. He found that the original mountain families of the Velea region were mostly gone, pushed out by Roman citizens, probably from nearby Placentia. By Trajan's time, some of the biggest farms were owned by freedmen with non-Roman names, likely business people from Placentia who went into farming and cattle raising. Many large farms in Italy were probably owned by local urban landlords, including both upper-class elites and successful merchants or bankers who wanted more respect in society. The Po Valley was the most productive part of Italy in the 1st century AD, as it still is today. The deep, rich soil had not been worn out. 200 years earlier, the local Celtic tribes, Boii, Senones, and Lingones, had been forced out, and Roman leader Aemilius Scaurus had drained swamps south of Padua to make more land usable. Rome had also founded many colonies in this area. North of the Po River, the local peoples, Insubres, Cenomani, and Veneti, had survived in smaller numbers and had become Roman citizens. Even though no official colonies were planted among them, many Romans and Italians moved there looking for land. These settlers built up large estates, became leaders in the newly Romanized towns, and hired local hill dwellers as cheap labor. In Augustus' time, the city of Padua had 500 knights, each worth at least $20,000, more than any city in Italy except Rome. This suggests that many of them were local landowners, and likely many other towns in the region had similar upper-class residents. The Po Valley produced many goods. Wheat was grown mainly to feed the growing cities. A large amount of wine was also produced, which sold well in the colder mountain areas of Dalmatia and Noricum. Pigs were raised in the oak forests near the mountains and shipped in large numbers to Rome. Lumber and pitch came from the nearby Alps and Apennines, and wool was gathered from large herds in the foothills. Some of this wool was spun and woven into cloth by women in the towns and sold as finished goods. Trade was active in this fast-growing region, where raw materials could be traded for luxury items. Ships sailed up the Po River as far as Cremona and Placentia. Cities like Milan, Como, Verona, and especially Aquileia had strong trade links, using the mountain passes that Augustus had cleared of bandits. These cities traded wine, metal goods, pottery, and inexpensive jewelry for cattle, hides, slaves, ores, and wood. This region had relatively few slaves and freedmen. It had been settled by Italians before trade, and industry were looked down upon as slave work, so its economy grew in a healthy and balanced way. The most important cities in the 1st century were Padua, Milan, Verona, Cremona, Aquileia, Placentia, Bologna, Mantua, Parma, Brescia, Como, Vicenza, Ravenna, Vercelli, and Trieste. It's no surprise that the Roman government eventually moved to this densely populated and prosperous region. It would be helpful to know more details about the economic changes during this period, especially since later developments like tenant farming and trade guilds became important. In terms of industry, large-scale production made little progress except in brick-making in Rome, which grew due to new building styles. In other industries, like copper, iron, pottery, and glass, Italy lost many of its export markets. This may have been because the provinces became more self-sufficient and no longer needed Italian imports, or because slaves became more expensive in Italy. Local small workshops, run mostly by freedmen, were able to meet the needs of each town. This shift didn't cause major disruption to the economy. Large-scale slave-based production had benefited only a few people, and the slaves who lost factory jobs were likely moved to farms where workers were needed. Production did not fall because Italy's cities were growing and needed more goods. By the end of the century, there were probably more small independent workshops, run by free men and maybe a few slaves, than at the beginning. Inscriptions suggest that more trade guilds of free workers were forming, which matches this change in the way goods were made. This change also helped free industries in the provinces grow. However, this move away from big businesses to small shops meant that large pools of money were broken up. This became a problem later on when the emperors needed emergency funds. Without large savings to borrow from, they had to devalue the currency or force people to hand over money to raise funds quickly. When it comes to how farms were managed, both big and small, the evidence is unclear and often debated. Historians may have oversimplified things by trying to apply conditions from the 3rd century to the 1st century. Italy is a large country with many different kinds of land and resources. So we can't really say with certainty that all of Italy was switching from gardens to wheat farming, or that slave labor was being replaced by tenant farmers, or the other way around, just based on a few casual remarks by Roman writers. When we look at what was grown on the land during this century, it seems that growing grain and maybe olives was slowly decreasing. Raising cattle stayed about the same, while growing grapes for wine, fruits, and vegetables was slowly increasing. The best source we have for this time is Columella's book on farming, written around the middle of the century. But we should remember that Columella had managed estates where he especially focused on growing grapes for wine, so he may have had a personal interest in that type of farming. These estates were in areas known for wine and fruit production: Albano, Cervetri, Ardea, and Carsioli. Still, Columella knew about all types of farming, and his book was meant to be a complete guide for farmers. He probably wrote it for wealthy landowners who were interested in farming. Columella does not say that wine growing had any problems with finding buyers. In fact, it's likely that there were no problems at all. The Italian population was larger, richer, and buying more local wine than in the century before. Italian wine had never been exported in large amounts. The only real export market had been Gaul, and even there, Greek wines were popular and sold through Marseille. So it's reasonable to think that wine producers in Italy had better sales during Nero's time, especially since the Italian wine god Bacchus was now even celebrated in famous poetry. In one part of his book, Columella gives an example of how much money a wine grower near Rome could make. He uses a 7 jugera plot as a model, but this was just a small part of a larger estate. He says that the yearly interest on the money invested, at 6%, would be about $93.30. He estimates that each jugerum could produce 1,500 quarts of wine per year, though he notes that Seneca's estate at Nomentum produced 4,000 quarts. The average wine price when low in Rome was 3 cents per quart. So each jugerum would bring in $45, and the whole 7 jugera plot would earn $315 per year, leaving over $31 profit per jugerum. If these numbers are correct, then wine growing was clearly a good business, even though Columella doesn't include costs like equipment replacement. He also says that extra profit could come from selling cuttings from the vineyard, suggesting that new vineyards were being planted more often. Neither Columella nor Pliny talks directly about the overall state of wine growing at the time. But both mention the best wines of Italy, and from their writings we can tell that grapes were grown in the same areas that are still known for wine today. Pliny even names some new wine types that had recently become popular. He says that only Falernian wine had lost some of its old fame, but even that was likely because wine from the nearby Faustinian estate had become more popular. Overall, the message from both writers is clear. Wine growing was spreading during this period. The idea that wine production was growing is supported by Domitian's famous law at the end of the century. He banned planting new vineyards in Italy and ordered that half the vines in the provinces be cut down. This order was soon cancelled after protests from the provinces. Domitian wasn't known for being a careful economic thinker and often made sudden decisions. Still, his reasons for wanting to limit wine production were likely real. For Italians, he claimed that grain production was falling because vineyards were taking up too much land. This was probably true. Vineyards need a lot of investment: plants, tools, storage jars, and trained workers. And once planted, they are rarely removed. Unlike yearly crops, vineyards can survive a couple of bad years and often expand too much, as Italy has experienced even in modern times. For people in the provinces, Domitian said too much wine caused disorder. His order was clearly too harsh, and he later admitted that. However, there is no reason to believe he was lying or that he just wanted to help Italian wine growers. There is no sign that Italy increased wine exports afterward. We do know that emperors like Trajan and Hadrien limited wine production on imperial estates in Africa. As for grain farming, Domitian's law shows that Italy was not growing enough wheat to feed its people at the time. We don't know if this was due to a bad harvest year. Italian wheat yields can change a lot depending on the weather, or if the shortage was long-term. It's probably the latter. Columella may help us understand this better, though he was more of an expert on wine than on grain. He often mentions that grain was grown between vineyard or orchard rows. This was called an arbustum. This method is still used in parts of Italy today, like the Po Valley and Campania. In this system, tree roots are forced to grow deep so that the topsoil can be used for other crops like grain and vegetables. When you ride from Milan to Bologna today, it may look like you're traveling through endless orchards, but that same area still produces lots of wheat, corn, and vegetables. This farming system explains why Columella once said he hadn't seen wheat in Italy produce more than a fourfold yield, about 7.5 bushels per acre, which is low. But Columella focused more on grapes and fruit, and used most of his fertilizer on those crops. To him, grain was a secondary crop grown in between other plants. So we shouldn't assume this low yield was typical for all of Italy. It's true that Italy's soil had been used for grain for centuries and was getting tired, but farmers knew how to keep the land fertile using manure and rotating crops with alfalfa, clover, and beans. Columella was especially enthusiastic about alfalfa, which he said improved the soil. His words sound like early modern farming guides. In grain-growing areas like Tuscany and the Po Valley, wheat was probably still grown effectively. Just because it grew poorly in Latium's vineyards doesn't mean it failed everywhere. Also, foreign grain didn't fully replace Italian wheat. Roman writers often worried about the city of Rome's grain supply, but we should remember that Rome was just one part of Italy. In Nero's time, Egypt sent about 5 million bushels of wheat to Rome each year, and Africa sent about twice that much. That was enough for Rome itself, and explains why farmers near the city might not bother with wheat. But the rest of Italy had around 15 million people, who would need more than 150 million bushels of wheat per year. Sicily and Sardinia probably provided less than 1% of that. Gaul, Spain, and the eastern provinces mostly grew enough only for themselves. Interestingly, 150 million bushels is about what modern Italy grows in a good year. Today's Italy includes Sicily and Sardinia, but also has more land used for crops like corn, tobacco, and oranges than in ancient times. So we can assume that in the 1st century, Italy grew a lot of wheat, and did it successfully. But it required very careful farming. The Romans must have realized that if farming practices became careless or inefficient, Italy would struggle to meet its food needs. Now we come to the difficult topic of farm labor and land renting. In different parts of Italy, different systems were used depending on the situation. In all areas, there were large farms worked by slaves under the direction of a slave manager, while in more remote areas, there were small farms owned and worked by free peasants. Experts agree on these two types. There were also other systems, though we aren't sure how common they were. Columella says that if a farm is too far away to manage directly and grows simple crops like grain, it's better to rent it out. He advises against renting to a middleman who would use slaves, so he seems to prefer free workers as renters. Pliny the Younger often talks about looking for new colony, and once he mentions how hard it was to find a good conductor. A colonus might be a small tenant farmer or a large contractor who hires peasants or slaves. A conductor is a manager who doesn't work the land himself, but oversees others. Pliny rented out his land, but we can't say for sure who worked on it. The scholar Heitland argued that during this time, most colony were middlemen who used the landowner's slaves to farm. This system is documented and appears in legal writings of the next century. But it's unclear if this was the main system used when the landowner wasn't present. In earlier times, Domitius had many colony working his land. Horace had 8 slaves at home and also rented out small plots. Columella mentions middlemen using their own slaves, not the landowners. Vespasian placed free peasant tenants on state lands. Columella and Pliny the Elder both say that free tenants were better than using slaves. All this makes Heitland's argument less convincing. Also, the agricultural situation was different across Italy. In Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, for example, inscriptions show there were fewer slaves. Many local landowners rented to Celtic and Ligurian peasants, who likely farmed small plots with basic tools. slave labor seems unlikely there. The fact that small leases were widely used before and after the 1st century suggests they were common during this time too. In places like Velia and Beneventum, many landowners lived on their farms and worked the land with help from family and a few slaves. Even on larger farms, the owners often took out the mortgages themselves, which means they likely lived there. Like Horace, they had both tenant farmers and slaves. The choice of system depended on the type of crop. If the crop needed a lot of money and care, like vineyards, the owner would keep control and use a slave manager. For grain fields, renting to tenants was more acceptable. Pliny's letters also show that the decision depended on the buildings already present, whether they had housing for slaves or tenants, whether the land had supplies, and what kind of labor was available nearby. Overall, we can assume that slave labor was common, especially on large estates, whether run by the owner, an agent, or a middleman. But there were also small landowners and many working peasant tenants, who are often mentioned in 3rd century writings. There is very little evidence for free wage labor or hiring outside contractors for farm work, though Seneca once sold his grape harvest while still on the vine to a contractor. The rise of imperial estates should also be mentioned because they became very important later. Augustus inherited large areas of land in Italy and the provinces from men like Maecenas and Agrippa. He put officials in charge of managing them. Tiberius added more land to this imperial property, both from his own inheritance and from confiscated estates like those of Sejanus and a wealthy mine owner, Marius. Normally, confiscated land was sold and the money given to the state, but under Tiberius it was added to the patrimonium. Caligula added lands once owned by Sextus Pompey, and Claudius added a bit more. Nero, who executed many aristocrats, caused the imperial estates to grow rapidly. Earlier we mentioned the rich farmland in Africa that had likely ended up in the hands of Roman nobles. This is probably the region Pliny was talking about when he said Nero took control of half of Africa. However, even more land was likely taken in Italy. We only get clear information about this from later records. For example, imperial estates are listed as neighboring farms 7 times in the Beneventan mortgage document and 4 times in the Velian one. Since Nero was the last of his dynasty, Vespasian could no longer call these estates patrimonial, meaning inherited family land. But instead of selling them or turning them over to the Senate's treasury, he kept them under the control of the fiscus, the emperor's private treasury, and appointed financial officials to manage them. Vespasian was both a businessman and a ruler who cared about Italy's welfare. So he seems to have made it his policy to place tenant farmers on these lands to work them for life. We don't know exactly how his system worked, but because these colonies needed close supervision and the estates often had large villas and gardens, it's likely that a middleman, or conductor, was placed in the villa to manage the colony and collect rent. He may have worked the central farm area as payment for his role. This is just an educated guess, but it's based on what we know later happened in Africa, where conductors managed land using the free labor of colony. In Italy, we don't hear of such free labor being required yet. Many confiscated estates probably still had slaves, so there was no need for labor from colony. But once the old slaves died off, it would have been easy to switch to the African system. So the old theory that the 3rd century colonate system, a kind of semi-serfdom, developed from these imperial estates seems reasonable. We should also note that the expansion of imperial estates didn't necessarily make them more productive. Replacing slave labor with free tenant farmers seemed like a good idea to both Pliny and Columella, if the owner kept a close watch on the land. Today, we might call slave-based capitalist farming scientific, but ancient writers don't support that view. The problem with imperial estates was that the emperor couldn't personally manage his land. he had to rely on procurators, who in turn hired contractors to run the farms. Both the procurators and the contractors often cared more about making money than maintaining the estate. They could even cheat the system by working together. Another issue was that procurators didn't have enough money to fix up poorly maintained estates. They also might not have had permission to use slave labor, even if it would have helped. And they didn't have the personal interest that an owner might have in improving the land. Dio of Prusa gives an example, possibly fictional but believable, of what happened in Euboea when the emperor, maybe Nero, took over a private estate. It was mostly rough hill country used for herding, with very little good farmland and no markets nearby. When the owner was executed and his land taken, the imperial official came, took the livestock and anything valuable, and left, without even paying the shepherds. Years later, when Dio visited the area, he found a few scared locals living on the deserted land, and the nearby town was in ruins. While Greece had already been struggling economically, it's not hard to believe that similar things happened in poor mountain regions of Italy when imperial officials took control of seized estates. Several actions by Roman emperors show that they were concerned about the population living in Italy's farming regions. This began with Nero, who chose to settle some of his veterans in Italy, while earlier emperors usually sent them to colonies in the provinces. As already mentioned, his efforts to settle veterans in Antium failed, but at Tarentum, more of them seem to have stayed. This is shown by their names appearing in local inscriptions. One of the officers given land there in 60 CE was Columella, whose farming advice has often been quoted. Tacitus also says that Capua and Nuceria received veterans, so it's likely Nero used some confiscated estates for this purpose. However, it's unlikely he gave away valuable vineyards or orchards to the soldiers. Vespasian, a smart observer of Italy's situation, rarely gave land in Italy to veterans. Instead, he usually settled them in the provinces. These veterans had served 20 years and were not the kind of people who would boost Italy's farming population. Still, inscriptions from Nola and a mention in the Liber Coloniarum suggest some colonists were placed in Campania. Vespasian's preferred method was to settle long-term tenant farmers on public land. The government clearly knew there was a shortage of strong, free citizens in Italy, as they started recruiting almost all new soldiers from the provinces. If Vespasian chose to replace slaves with free tenant farmers, it was likely because he understood Italy's real condition. Some scholars believe his decision to give citizenship and Latin rights to many people in Spain was partly because he needed new areas to find soldiers. It's also worth noting that in at least 2 places where he settled colony, he also rented land to people from his own household. These may have been loyal slaves who were freed and placed as tenant farmers. If this practice became common, it would help explain why the colonate system later included so many poor, humble people. Although Nerva ruled for only a short time, 2 of his decisions were important. First, he proposed a law to buy land in Italy using 60 million sesterces and divide it among the poor. This amount of money could provide around 10,000 small farms. The fact that he had to buy land suggests that previous emperors had already settled most of the good public land with tenant farmers. The poor in Rome probably wouldn't have tolerated slaves farming government land, while they themselves were landless. The second measure was the famous alimenta system, which we've mentioned before. We don't hear much about its details until Trajan's time, but Nerva's administration likely planned it out. The idea was to loan money permanently to farmers across Italy. The interest from these loans would be collected by local committees and given to families with free-born children to help with raising them. In total, about 100 million sesterces were distributed this way. Ancient sources suggest that the main goal was to help families raise more children and increase the birth rate. This was clearly considered a big issue, as shown by how often the theme appeared on monuments. According to the historian Dio, Nerva also had another goal: helping farmers by providing loans at reasonable interest rates. Since loans were only made for about 10% of the value of the land, the money was spread across many farms. This probably made credit cheaper, helped people pay off debts, and temporarily raised land and crop prices. However, the loans were permanent, meaning they placed a long-term burden on the land. After the early benefits faded, farmers likely struggled more than before during bad harvests. So, while the program may have worked better as a charity than as a farming reform, even its charity goals didn't last. By the end of the century, inflation had reduced the value of the returns from the loans. Most of the money ended up just paying the staff of the Roads and Food Aid Bureau, and very little actually reached the poor children the program was meant to support. When Emperor Hadrien traveled through the Roman provinces a little over 100 years after Augustus' death, he found that the Mediterranean world was enjoying a level of wealth and happiness it would never fully reach again. Here, we'll briefly look at how the economy developed in some provinces during a century of Roman rule. In Africa, for example, the province originally consisted of a small strip of land. Later, under Caesar and Augustus, Numidia and a fertile coastal area known today as Tripolis were added, and later Caligula annexed Mauritania. In Caesar's time, Africa's grain tax was very small, only about 300,000 bushels of wheat. But 100 years later, it had increased to about 10 million bushels. This rise in cereal production is impressive, even if part of it came from new territories like Mauritania or from imperial estates that had previously not paid taxes. It shows that Roman settlers were farming the taxed land carefully, and that many Numidian people had given up herding and turned to farming. However, this progress was not the same everywhere in the province. Around Carthage and Duga, the best land had already been taken before Augustus, so new settlers had to go farther inland or into the hills between Sicca and Mactaris, or settle in coastal Punic towns. At first, it seemed that these areas would become fully Roman, but immigration slowed down when land confiscations in Italy stopped, and emperors began settling veterans in Asia, Syria, and the Balkans instead. From then on, each part of Africa developed differently. Carthage, supported by its rich farmland, trade routes, and political influence, grew quickly. It attracted Punic people who had moved inland and Numidians who had grown used to city life. Carthage became wealthy and culturally non-Roman. Many luxurious homes were built in its suburbs, but not many large country villas have been found nearby, suggesting that landowners preferred to live in the city. Near Uthena, farther away, many large villas have been found, likely because there were locals available to work the land. The area around Duga had a strange development. Although it had good land and had been settled for a long time, its villages didn't grow into cities as fast as less fertile areas further south. This was because some Roman nobles had already taken over large pieces of land there and farmed them using local villagers as tenants. Under emperors Claudius and Nero, several of these estates were taken over by the state after their owners were executed. Imperial managers, called procurators, grouped the land into large estates and placed conductores in charge. These conductores had 5-year contracts. They supervised tenant farmers, collected rents, and made money by farming a special piece of land rent-free called the home field. To lower their labor costs, they could require tenants to work for them 6 days a year during busy seasons. This system, first used by private landlords, worked well for owners who didn't live on their estates. But it wasn't good for the tenants or the land itself. Imperial officials and short-term overseers didn't care much about tenant well-being or improving farming methods. Also, because imperial land couldn't be sold, tenants had no hope of owning their plots, and outside farmers with better techniques weren't allowed in. Even worse, A third of all produce from imperial land was sent directly to Rome instead of being used locally, which hurt the economy in those regions. Villages often declined as a result. Although Thuga became a regional center with some nice buildings, mostly thanks to nearby private estates, it never grew into a great success, considering the rich soil and long history of farming there. If this was typical, we must conclude that imperial land ownership didn't contribute much to Africa's growth. Inscriptions found in the region have caused much discussion. They are helpful for understanding how Rome managed land in Africa, even if they don't explain changes elsewhere. Some inscriptions mention that citizens were under the authority of imperial agents instead of local city governments. This may have happened because emperors owned so much land there, or because local governments faded away when big landlords bought up entire towns. Another detail worth noting is the early appearance of the corvée, unpaid labor owed by tenants, as part of rent. This wasn't related to forced labor like canal work in Egypt. It probably started when wealthy landlords took over towns and began managing local road or temple repairs themselves. Instead of community service, tenants now had to do that labor directly for the landlords. Some landlords in Africa had already started offering better rental terms to tenants before the emperor took control. These landlords promised to give permanent leaseholds to tenants who would plant orchards on rough land. These tenants didn't have to pay rent until their orchards started producing crops, and they were allowed to grow small plants between the trees without being taxed. However, when the imperial administrators took over, they were mainly focused on short-term profits and discouraged this practice. When Emperor Hadrien visited Africa, he realized that land that was too rough for plowing or worn out from growing wheat could still grow olives or grapes well. Although he didn't want to encourage grape growing due to Domitian's earlier concerns, he issued a law that allowed the use of abandoned or unused land under certain conditions. This law likely had a big impact, especially on tribal lands still used for grazing. The fear of losing land might have encouraged nomadic tribes to start farming it. Landowners may have also used the law to pressure tribes into selling land, which could explain the spread of private farms among Numidian tribes during the 2nd century. The state likely benefited from this, since owners knew they could lose land if they didn't farm it within 2 years. So, Hadrian's decree probably helped increase farming and prosperity across the region. The old Phoenician port towns south of Carthage stayed mostly the same during this time. Carthage took over some of their trade, and the land behind these towns wasn't very fertile. Still, they kept some trade links and even had offices at Ostia's shipping center. Most of this coast could grow olives and some wheat, but only within 15 to 20 miles of the sea. Beyond that was dry land used by nomads during winter rains for grazing animals. Further west lay a plateau, from Sika to Thalepte, that got a bit more rain. Beneath its valleys was enough moisture to grow olives if the trees were watered well during their early years. When the Romans first arrived, this area was controlled by nomads. But by the 2nd century, it had turned into a huge olive-growing region, stretching from Mactaris through Sufes, Cilium, Sufetula, and Thalepte. Towns grew quickly, surrounded by villages and large farms. Between Sufetula and Cilium, archaeologists have found remains of 1,000 olive presses. Today, Sufetula has fewer than 100 residents, and the area is almost empty. It's hard to explain how Rome managed to succeed so well in farming here. It seems this success was more by chance than by planning, since nobody back then knew the land could be useful. Rome's first goal was to stop nomadic migrations, which they thought caused banditry. As Romans, they believed civilization meant settled living and farming. In 14 AD, Tiberius's army built a road for a legion that would bring order to the area. It connected Takape on the coast to the oasis of Capsa, then to Amidara near farmland. This road cut off nomads from migrating from the west and south, angering tribes like the Gaetuli and Musulami. In 17 AD, led by Tacfarinas, they rebelled. The war lasted 7 years until Tacfarinas was killed. After the war, some nomads left the area, while others accepted land and peace. Since they needed new ways to live, and wheat didn't grow well there, they likely turned to olives. A village grew around the Amidara army camp to support the soldiers. Along the main road from Hadrien, villages formed wherever there were water sources. Veterans and coastal traders settled there. Eventually, people from Carthage and Italy heard about these new towns. They bought land and hired skilled managers from nearby cities to run their farms. Within a century, the area was thriving. In many ways, this story is repeating today, with the French acting like the Romans, Arabs in place of the Phoenicians, and Berbers instead of Numidians. This example shows how Rome usually handled things in Africa before Emperor Hadrian's time. The Roman government didn't seem to care much about the social or economic lives of the local people. They mainly focused on keeping order and collecting taxes, following old Roman practices. Some historians have guessed that Tiberius sent his army to push out local tribes and make room for Roman settlers. But this idea is doubtful. The land was poor, few Italians were moving to Africa at the time, and there is no real sign of Roman settlement in places like Sufetula and Cilium before the Flavian period. So it's unlikely that Rome had an economic reason for Tiberius' military actions. Some have also suggested that the Roman government tried to civilize the native people by turning them into town dwellers. But there is no solid proof for this either. In some areas, Roman soldiers were given land and small towns were formed. In other places, native villages slowly became towns because Roman roads helped trade grow, or because farming became necessary once migration stopped. Farming brought people together. Where Romans did settle, they needed local workers and renters, so natives often moved to towns naturally. All these changes were mostly due to natural social and economic developments, not direct government policy. In fact, some inscriptions from the 3rd century show that tribal systems still existed alongside Roman-style towns between Cilium and Thalepte. To the west of this plateau region, new towns mainly appeared as the Roman army moved west. During the Flavian period, when the land south of Amidara was safe enough, a colony for veterans was founded. These veterans were mostly Italians. The army then moved west to Tavest, an old Numidian Punic town in a productive plain. Later, in Trajan's time, the army moved west again and left another group of veterans. These veterans were mostly Asians who had become Roman citizens. Over time, Tavesta grew into one of the province's richest cities. The legion may have stayed for a while at Mascula, but by the year 123, it had settled permanently at Lambaesis. From there, the soldiers could defend the Numidian plains against attacks from wild tribes living in the high Auras Mountains or coming up from Biskra. Near their base at Lambaesis, the soldiers helped build a planned town at Timgad. It had a forum, temples, theaters, and a military colony to help protect the area. Even though rainfall was low, Timgad was close to the forested Aures Mountains, which provided spring water for drinking and even some irrigation, something rare in Africa. The settlers were mostly Roman Africans, or Africans who had become Roman in culture. Starting with Emperor Marcus Aurelius, more and more of the veterans were of mixed background. Soldiers at Lambaesis often married local women, and their sons joined the army too. As the legion moved west, farming spread with them. People from many different places, Roman settlers, African Romans, and Numidians looking to settle and make money, mixed together to form the fast-growing population. We don't need to examine more regions, because the 4 areas already discussed show the quiet but effective impact of the Pax Romana. Still, we should not think that Roman culture spread everywhere, or that the local people were forced to adopt it if they didn't want to. Some mountain regions between the Bagradus River and the sea were hardly affected by Roman influence. The native shepherds continued living in their traditional ways. The same was true for the tribes in the Aures Mountains and parts of the old Musulami tribe who lived between Sica and Madoros. Even near large, successful Roman cities, many native groups who worked for the Romans or rented land from them still kept their own tribal leaders, customs, and religion, just as some Berber groups did later under French rule. The Berbers have a unique ability to resist foreign cultures while still using parts of them, and just wearing Roman clothes didn't mean they changed their way of life. Rome's expansion into Africa, like in other places, was slow. The government mainly wanted to make sure that some basic form of order and local leadership existed. Considering that Rome didn't have many settlers to send from Italy, and that the Numidians were independent-minded people, Roman efforts were surprisingly successful. The impressive ruins of cities like Thuga, Sufetula, Tisdrus, Tamugadi, Cilium, and Madoros still rise from the dry grasslands, showing how different Roman rule was from that of Carthage. These cities were clean, had good drainage systems, and plenty of water tanks. Romans were good at understanding what the land could offer and using it well. Even though they didn't make strong efforts to Romanize the people and the Roman population in Africa was small, the province still produced some of the greatest literature of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. This suggests that Rome's hands-off approach worked better than forcing change. However, Rome did fail in one important area: religion. The Numidians were deeply religious, and the strict Punic religion met their needs. But the Roman imperial religion never became popular. Even though the Romans kindly built temples to Punic gods, just under Roman names, and only banned human sacrifice, this blending of beliefs didn't appeal to the locals. Later, Christianity fulfilled the spiritual needs of the people and spread faster and more completely in Africa than in any other Roman province. Christianity might have completed the process of Romanization, but unfortunately, the region became divided between 2 forms of the religion. The less developed Numidian tribes mostly followed the version that the Roman state didn't support. These were the people who needed unity the most. We will return to the topic of Africa's fall later and see that it was not Rome's hands-off policy that caused the downfall. This policy actually achieved more than strict control ever could. Africa mainly produced raw materials, and most of them were used locally. Neither the local people nor their rulers, the Carthaginians and Romans, developed crafts or art that stood out. They did create colorful floor mosaics, which they were proud of. Later, these influenced Moorish art in Spain, but most Roman mosaics from Africa are simple and not very skilled. The land's natural limits also affected farming. Vineyards did well in the north, but needed irrigation in the south, where water sources often dried up in the summer. Wheat was difficult to grow south of the Zagouan Mountains, and even where it was possible, the dry summers made it hard to rotate crops, which is necessary for long-term farming. Farther west, the land was hilly and suffered from erosion when plowed, so it was inevitable that the province would produce less wheat over time compared to the rich harvests of Hadrian's era. The olive tree, on the other hand, was more reliable. It could survive long dry periods and became more popular. In the north, people planted olives on hills where wheat had failed. In the valleys near Sufetula, the olive roots could reach underground moisture that annual crops couldn't. Around Hadrumetum, The last rains of spring were carefully directed to the roots to keep trees alive through the summer. Even at Sfax, where rainfall is only about 20 centimeters per year, Arabs, who understood the climate well, could get about 15 gallons of oil from each tree. The Carthaginians knew some of these techniques, but it was under Roman rule that olive farming spread into the dry inland regions. Other local products included figs, dates from oases, wool, dyes, fish, quality wood for furniture making, ivory, and the famous Numidian marble from Simithu. But exports were not a major focus. Most of the food and goods were used by the growing cities. In Nero's time, Rome received around 10 million bushels of wheat from Africa, and this likely continued into the 3rd century. Today, North Africa produces about 15 times more grain than back then, even with less advanced farming, so the Roman demand wasn't overwhelming. Also, much of the wheat came not from taxes, but from rent paid on land owned by the Roman emperors. Roman Spain is still a bit of a mystery, because not many ancient sites there have been properly dug up. For some reason, most Spanish cities, except for a few built directly by Rome, didn't show the same level of decoration or public buildings as those in Roman Africa. At the same time, there weren't many grand countryside villas like in Roman Gaul. Still, we know that southern and eastern Spain had rich farming areas, busy cities, and strong trade. Even the less fertile central region did fairly well. Baetica, in the south, became Romanized as fast as southern Gaul, and even earlier than Africa. It also seemed to suffer less from the emperor taking land than these other provinces. In fact, like Gaul and Africa, Baetica was considered so civilized that it was spared the imperial religion for a while. The rest of Spain also received Latin rights from Vespasian at a time when Africa and Central Gaul weren't yet considered ready. Things become even more confusing when we realize that Spain made major contributions to Roman literature earlier than Africa and Gaul, but later stopped, just as those other provinces began to shine in literature. There is no doubt that Spain, especially the south, was wealthy. Ancient writers like Pliny, Mela, and Martial, who knew Spain well, praised it highly. Near the old docks of Rome, a huge hill called Monte Testaccio is made entirely of broken pots that once carried Spanish goods like wine, oil, and fish to the capital. The mound is about 150 feet tall and half a mile around, proving how much Spain exported. When we see the same pot markings across the western provinces, we know these Spanish products reached faraway places like Britain, Holland, and Germany. The large herds of animals on the central plains provided wool, which was woven for export in towns such as Cordova and Saguntum. Linen, a long-standing local craft, was produced in places like Setebis, Emporia, and Tarraco, and was popular in Rome. Spanish steel from Bilbilis and Toledo was considered the best. Esparto grass from dry regions was widely exported for making ropes and mats. Spanish horses and sheep were top-quality breeds. In the southern waters, fishing companies, licensed by the government, produced the best garum. The mines were especially rich, producing iron, lead, copper, tin, silver, mercury, and gold. These mines were still among the most productive in the Roman world. Although the state owned the mines, inscriptions and rules from places like the copper mines at Aljustrel show that Spanish companies ran them and shared half of the profits with the government. These industries supported local Spanish workers. With all this success, it's surprising that we haven't found more evidence of great art in Spain. Maybe the ruins we've found aren't typical, or maybe we've overestimated how advanced Roman Spain really was, possibly because of the early fame of Cordovan writers and the fact that Vespasian gave Latin rights to the whole region. One theory is that Vespasian didn't do this because of Spain's advanced culture, but but because he needed new soldiers for the Roman army. After deciding to stop using Italian recruits, he had to find other sources for his 30 legions. It wasn't common before to let Latin citizens join the legions, but this could change. And we know that Spain soon began providing more full soldiers than just auxiliary troops. Oddly, Vespasian didn't give full Roman citizenship to the older Latin colonies from Caesar's time. Still, the grant of Latin status meant that local cities were organized with their own town laws, like those in Italy. We've found parts of 2 of these town charters, which show that the usual Roman system was followed. It's unclear whether this could have worked well in the mountain areas of northwest Spain. In those areas, Rome probably assigned rural and shepherd communities to nearby towns just for tax purposes. Even if some of these towns disappeared later, nobody likely asked questions, as long as tribal leaders made sure the taxes were paid. And the fact that the Basque language is still spoken today in much of northern Spain shows us that Roman rule there may not have been as deep or as complete as it looked. There is not much clear evidence that the Roman emperors owned a lot of land in Spain. During his military campaigns in 49 and 45 BC, Julius Caesar took land from towns that had supported his enemies. But instead of keeping this land for the state, he gave it to loyal communities and to his army veterans and freedmen from the cities. Later, Augustus took land from the Lusitanians after defeating them in war, but again, he used it mostly to create colonies for veterans. Tiberius took control of the mines once owned by Marius in the Sierra Morena Mountains, and these, like the mines captured earlier by Scipio, stayed under state control. Some of Nero's land seizures affected Romans who owned property in Spain, but Galba later seems to have sold that land. Overall, it looks like imperial officials had little farmland to manage in Spain until the time of the Severan emperors. Unfortunately, those emperors brought destruction to Spain, just as they did in Italy and Gaul. From their time onward, Spain began to decline. To sum up what we know about Spain before the Severan period, it seems the southern part of the country was already quite advanced and well developed by the local people even before the Romans arrived. As a result, fewer Roman settlers took land there compared to places like Africa or Asia. However, the Roman civil wars did lead to some new colonies, and Augustus settled many of his veterans in Spain. For a time, Roman culture had a strong presence, and the children of these early settlers took part in Roman politics and arts. But then, somewhat unexpectedly, Roman influence began to fade. The freedmen and veterans blended into the local population rather than creating strong centers of Roman culture. And after that, not enough new Roman immigrants came to Spain to maintain the earlier influence. It's true that the Latin language spread in Spain, mainly because of trade and returning veterans, but most people only learned the basics. Very few went deeper into Roman culture. For example, no classical literature manuscripts from Spain survive today, except for Christian religious texts. Except for a few cities like Emerita, Taraco, and Italica, which were partly built by Romans, there are few signs of major public buildings, temples, or theaters. In this way, Spain is clearly behind Africa, where more Romans had settled and left their mark. Even though Rome unified the region and created peace, which helped bring prosperity, it never deeply changed Iberian culture, just like the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Carthaginians before them. From each foreign culture, the Iberians adopted useful skills and tools, but kept their own identity. In contrast, Narbonese Gaul became a rich and productive area. The Celts living beyond this region were slowly adopting Roman ways, building homes, using Roman dishes, drinking wine, spending money, and even taking out loans. The older Roman province learned how to supply and profit from this new market. Fruit orchards and vineyards brought in good money, especially since central Gaul was still too cold for such crops. Large farms appeared across Provence and the valleys of Savoy, where these plants could grow. The region also had many pottery and metal workshops, especially in Auvergne, to meet the growing demand. Big trading cities like Narbo and Arelate developed quickly. Narbo carried goods from the Mediterranean to Aquitania and the western coast, while Arles took over the role of Marseille as the main port on the Rhône River. Narbo grew faster at first because it was older and already had many customers, but Arles eventually became more successful because of its better location. Arles attracted skilled freedmen who worked as traders and bankers, hired Celtic workers for river transport, and also brought in experienced merchants from Marseille who understood how to do business with the Celts. Arles became a busy, wealthy, and crowded port city. Its most famous building, then and now, was a huge amphitheater. Meanwhile, agricultural towns like Nemausus, Arausio, and Vienna also did well. But they grew in a more careful and graceful way, taking time to invest in lasting architecture. The Maison Carrée in Nîmes is still considered one of the most beautiful Roman temples. The Pont de Garde, an aqueduct bridge that brought water to Nîmes, is still impressive today. The theater in Orange is one of the biggest ever built in the Western Roman world. The story of Celtic Gaul is surprising for anyone expecting Rome to act like a protective or mission-driven ruler. In Gaul, it's hard to talk about Roman policies that aimed to civilize, urbanize, or Romanize. In fact, it's likely that more Gauls lived in towns or village communities before Caesar's conquest than they did 150 years later. The Celts naturally liked to live in groups, but Caesar destroyed many of their large hill forts, and the few market towns he built didn't really replace the older way of life. Later, Roman emperors also didn't push for building new cities in Gaul. The Romans still believed that landowners should live on their farms, just like they did in the early Roman Republic. Augustus used the tribal structures for administration and didn't require towns to govern the people. For him, it was enough if the tribal elders gathered wherever they liked, under trees or by the road, so long as they collected and paid their taxes. Even when tribes were given Latin or Roman citizenship, there was no pressure to create formal towns. Still, it's surprising that the Gauls were so slow to form towns. One reason might be that the Gallic nobles, who once needed town life for political power, now focused on their lands and hunting, so they preferred to live in the countryside with their servants and horses. The historian Fustel de Coulanges once said that Roman Gaul became a land of country estates, not cities. He may have overstated it, but he claimed that most modern French towns are named after Roman farms, not old villages. This is actually an important observation, and later excavations of these villa sites have supported his claim. The archaeologist Grenier described many of these grand estates, including 53 found near Metz, in an area only 10 kilometers wide. Some of these villas were so big they covered 2 acres. They were just as common near Rouen and in the land of the Allobroge. North of Metz, near the Rhine River, they appeared about 2 miles apart in a regular pattern, possibly because Rome gave land in this area to loyal nobles after seizing it. These estates were found everywhere, and in the richer parts of Gaul they became very large and luxurious. One villa at Chirigan near Toulouse covered 6 acres and had stables, storage buildings, workshops, baths, and living spaces. These villas, like medieval estates later on, became self-sufficient communities. They housed not only the landowners, but also their workers and slaves. Some even had their own temples, schools, and theaters. They became small cultural centers. In fact, the reason why classical literature stayed alive longer in Gaul than in other parts of the Western Empire during the 4th century was because these wealthy landowners supported libraries and learning. We also hear about a lot of debt in Gaul during the 1st century, which suggests that the nobles may have spent more money than they earned while developing their estates. But they seem to have recovered later. The land was fertile, and learning from southern trade partners helped them grow vineyards and fruit successfully. Trade brought good profits from selling grain, wool, and livestock. Writers like Ausonius, Sidonius, and Ammianus mention estates so large that their descriptions must have sounded unbelievable to readers in Italy, almost like fairy tales. Although farming was the main support of Gaul's economy, it wasn't the only source of income. Lugdunum became a major center for receiving goods coming up the Rhone River and for gathering local products to be sent elsewhere. Its merchants quickly gained control of the trade moving in and out of the region. By the time of Emperor Hadrien, Lyon had clearly become more important than the cities in Provence. Since it was also the seat of joint provincial administration, it became the leading city in Gaul. Meanwhile, the military camps along the border, housing 7 or 8 legions along with many auxiliary troops, created a steady flow of trade toward the Rhine. Gaul was allowed to supply these camps with weapons, armor, horses, food, and clothing. The scale of this business was clearly large, since later, when the government took control of weapons production, military factories appeared in cities like Amiens, Soissons, Reims, Trier, Mâcon, and Strasbourg. And it wasn't just the soldiers who needed goods. By the 2nd century, the legions were mostly settled in permanent bases. Soldiers often married, and towns developed around the camps to house their families, traders, and others who followed the army. This new economy along the border is well shown by the inscriptions and ruins found in Trier, which became the main trade center after Lyon was destroyed by fire. In Trier and nearby towns like Noviomagus, we see many fancy tombstones belonging to upstart merchants, Germans, Eastern freedmen, Celts, Romans, and locals, who had become so successful in trade that they proudly decorated their graves with images of their wealth. Boats filled with wine barrels, shelves stacked with cloth, carts full of fruit, money bags, books of accounts, and coin counters. Clearly, Gaul was a wealthy place. In the eastern part of the empire, things were very different during the early Roman period. Greece, in particular, had long been in decline. The historian Polybius sadly noted that the population had dropped sharply by the 2nd century BC. The land had been overused by farming and worn down by erosion on the steep hills. Trade had shifted east after Alexander the Great and west after Rome rose to power. Meanwhile, richer regions had taken the slaves that Greece once used in farming and industry. As poverty increased, more people remained unmarried, and many abandoned their children. This downward trend continued steadily, as noted by the geographer Strabo. In his time, Arcadia had returned to grazing land, and most of the cities in the Peloponnese were in ruins. Only Corinth was doing well. It had been rebuilt as a trading city and filled with freedmen. Writings by authors like Dio of Prusa, Plutarch, Pausanias, and Apuleius suggest that Greece's condition didn't improve under Roman rule. Athens kept a decent appearance, thanks to donations from emperors and wealthy nobles, who, in return, were honored with unattractive statues. The city also survived in part due to money spent by tourists and students. But Athens' once thriving trade and industries had disappeared. Some clever people in Greece had taken advantage of the failing farms by buying up abandoned land to use for grazing animals and planting olive trees. A few of them became rich. But overall, the decline of public donations, often mentioned in 3rd century BC inscriptions, and the lack of large imperial estates showed that Greece was not making a recovery. Plutarch may have been exaggerating when he said that all of Greece couldn't gather 3,000 soldiers, hoplites, in his time. Still, even after adjusting for overstatement, his comment reflects how far Greece had declined. Asia Minor was somewhat more fortunate than Greece. During the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire, Rome gradually brought the small eastern kingdoms all the way to Armenia under direct control. As the empire expanded eastward, new military roads were built to follow the frontier. One important road went from Nicomedia to Ancyra and was extended to Melitene, with branches reaching Nicopolis, central Cappadocia, and the Black Sea. Other roads branched off the main Ephesus to Syria route, heading south into Cilicia and north into Cappadocia. These roads were most often built under the Flavian emperors, and later under Trajan and Septimius Severus, as seen from the milestone inscriptions. This road building brought economic changes. Trade within the region improved, and because the weather and farming conditions varied across villages and mountain areas, crop failures were usually local and not widespread. Thanks to the roads, food and supplies could be moved from other areas, lessening the damage of bad harvests. Also, industries in many cities could now bring in raw materials from a wider region. Inscriptions confirm that cities like Laodicea, Philadelphia, and Thyatira, once known for textiles, carpets, and dyeing, continued to do well in these trades. Population patterns also changed. Some old towns lost importance, not because the economy was failing, but because people moved to places better connected by the new roads. Some villages grew enough in size to earn town status. This wasn't because the Roman government pushed for big cities. In fact, the emperors often preferred recruiting soldiers from rural villages over city people from the more Greek-influenced areas. But naturally, better transportation helped gather people in growing centers. Still, this shift shouldn't be exaggerated. People in central Anatolia seemed to enjoy their traditional, simple way of life, and they continued farming and herding animals as before. Foreign trade didn't grow very much. Ports like Ephesus, Tarsus, Cyzicus, Nicomedia, and Sinope did gain from the expansion of Roman control, and merchants from these cities are mentioned in inscriptions found far away. But these traders usually worked with small to moderate amounts of goods. Nowhere in Asia Minor do we find signs of large-scale industrial production. Archaeologists have found impressive Roman public buildings in Ephesus and signs of continued prosperity in Sardis, even after a big earthquake in 17 AD. Many towns built public baths, walkways, and aqueducts during this time. But as Pliny the Younger noted in his letters, cities often tried to outdo each other in public building projects, sometimes borrowing too much money to do so. Some grand construction projects were never even finished properly, so we shouldn't assume that all these foundations meant lasting prosperity. We still don't fully understand the economic situation of different social classes in Asia Minor. There were certainly some very rich landowners, including not just Romans, but also Greeks and local people. It's likely that the old estates from the time of the Attalid kings had become large landholdings, latifundia, where local villagers worked as tenant farmers and paid rent to wealthy landlords. Many cities also had nearby villages connected to them, a practice the Romans used in the Alps, Gaul, and Spain to make local government easier. But from writings like those of Dio of Prusa, we know that villagers often demanded full rights as citizens of the nearby cities. Rome didn't seem to care much whether they got those rights or not. On the emperor's own estates, local people were treated according to traditional customs. They were considered permanent tenants of the land. Inscriptions found near Philadelphia from the time of Septimius Severus show that some groups, when complaining about soldiers' bad behavior, said they were born on the land and that their families had lived there for generations. At that time, there is no sign that these people were treated like serfs or slaves. However, our evidence from that period is limited. There was another group of native people, or rather several different groups, that created a special challenge. Many temples in Asia Minor owned large areas of farmland that were worked by hieroduli, meaning sacred slaves or temple laborers. For example, in Strabo's time, the temples at Comana in Cappadocia and Comana in Pontus each had about 6,000 hieroduli. Some of these people were temple slaves, while others were temple courtesans, who were probably also enslaved. But the men who worked the land were likely more like serfs, people tied to the land rather than full slaves. When Rome took over these temple estates in Pontus and Cappadocia and began appointing the priests, Roman officials had to decide what to do with the hieroduli. Roman law did not officially recognize the category of serfs, so there was no clear rule to follow. What actually happened likely varied from place to place. In some cases, Rome may have accepted local customs and allowed a kind of semi-serf status, as we know happened in many places by the 4th century. In the case of Comana in Pontus, it's possible the hieroduli were reclassified as free tenants, because later a municipality was established there. In other cases, the hieroduli may have been considered slaves under Roman law. For instance, near Antioch in Pisidia, Strabo says the Roman governor abolished the old temple system. Since people from that area later became citizens of Antioch, it's likely the governor ignored their previous slave status and instead treated them as free tenants working temple land that was turned into imperial land. It seems this change happened quickly. However, we still don't know exactly how quickly or how widely Rome accepted the idea of serfdom in Anatolia. We can't draw firm conclusions based on just one or two unclear examples. Still, it's possible that local Asian customs helped set the stage for the later Roman practice of tying farmers and tenants to the land, a system that eventually became common across the empire. A student studying the political history of Rome might think that the time of the 5 good emperors was a period of success and stability. But if one looks more closely at the cultural history of that time, it becomes clear that this impression is misleading. For example, Roman literature basically ended with Tacitus and Juvenal. In the next 100 years, there was not a single Latin poem or essay of even modest quality, not one important piece of criticism, philosophy, or original storytelling. Not even a valuable scholarly. This is a very important fact because we cannot find any other period in history where intellectual stagnation continued for so long during what appeared to be stable times. So theories that blame Rome's later decline only on the chaos of the 3rd century or foreign invasions are not enough. It's more likely that the empire's later disasters were the result of deeper weaknesses that had already started showing in the 2nd century, and that these problems were part of a larger sickness we still don't fully understand. It wasn't just literature that declined. All of the arts were fading quickly. The carvings on Marcus Aurelius's column and the arch of Septimius Severus show poor artistic design and weak craftsmanship. Later, wall paintings in Ostia had childish subjects and poor quality. By the middle of the 3rd century, Roman sculpture wasn't even as good as the work of simple stonecutters. Rome's religious life was also in trouble. Eastern religions were becoming more popular, and the old Roman gods mostly survived only in official texts or as names covering foreign beliefs. In politics, local self-government was falling apart. Trajan had to send officials to the provinces to check financial records, stop corruption, and guide local leaders. Hadrien later extended this system of overseers to Italian cities as well. In law, there was still some energy left, because the growing population in the provinces needed the old Roman legal rules to be updated. But interestingly, the same legal experts who worked on this also laid the foundation for absolute imperial power. Clearly, They no longer trusted ordinary citizens to think wisely or rule themselves effectively. When we look at the 3rd century, we will talk about the failure of farming, the collapse of trade and production, worthless coinage, heavy taxes, and all the economic problems brought on by civil war and invasions. But we must remember that the Romans entered this time already weakened. In the 3rd century, the people no longer showed the strength, independence, and problem-solving spirit that had once defined Rome. The barbarian invaders the emperors faced weren't stronger than the ones defeated by earlier Roman generals like Curius, Scipio, or Marius. The demands on Rome's resources were less than what the Republic had handled during the Punic Wars, and the farming problems were not more difficult than those that Cato would have tackled. The real difference was that the empire no longer had people capable of dealing with the problems it faced. Without going over everything again, we can say that Rome's economic decline cannot be fully understood without realizing that the original population that had made Rome strong was mostly gone. The long wars of the Republic had cost many lives. The opening of new lands in Africa, Spain, Gaul, and Asia had spread Italians far from home. Tyranny had killed many leaders, driven others into exile, and made family life harder. In their place, large numbers of slaves had been brought to Rome, and now their descendants made up most of the population around the capital. These new citizens might one day have become as capable as the people they replaced. After all, mixed populations have built strong nations before. But it takes a long time for different groups to become united, especially when those groups started out as slaves, carrying social and emotional burdens. There wasn't enough time for this blending to fully happen across the empire. It would have taken generations to build shared interests, pride, and unity among all the people. When one emperor finally wrote down his message of equality for this mixed population, he wrote it in Greek. Both the language and content of his writing show just how far Roman culture had collapsed. To outsiders, Rome still looked successful. But this was only surface-level success. Peaceful enough for the moment, but not creating the strength needed to face future problems. As we've seen, conditions across the Roman Empire were not the same everywhere. In Italy, there were signs that rural farming communities were struggling. Vespasian's decision to stop recruiting soldiers from Italy, Domitian's efforts to promote grain farming, Trajan's rural loan programs, charities, and settlement projects, and Hadrian's close supervision of local governments may have all been well-meaning attempts to keep Italy strong. But they also suggest that signs of decline were already visible. Roman officials usually didn't act unless problems were clear. Italy's farmland had been used heavily for centuries. Even though some areas had time to recover, other regions had been overworked and now needed longer breaks between planting seasons. Also, more and more land was being worked by tenants during the 2nd century, as Roman legal writings suggest. And tenants who worked for absent landlords often treated the land poorly. Industry was also changing. With fewer slaves available and more goods being produced in the provinces, large-scale industry in Italy had declined. This shift wasn't necessarily bad for society, since many small business owners and freedmen took over the work. But it did mean that large sums of money that could have helped the government in a crisis were now spread out in smaller amounts across many individuals. At the same time, the Roman government was taking on more responsibilities and increasing taxes to cover the cost. Under Nerva and Trajan, large amounts of money, possibly equal to $100 million today, were spent on charities in Italy. From Vespasian to Hadrian, massive public works projects were carried out across the empire, including road building in Spain, Africa, Gaul, the Danube region, Anatolia, and Syria. The government also funded new buildings in many cities, far more than before. Rome, Athens, and Carthage received large sums, but so did many smaller cities. Hadrian's biographer even claimed there was hardly a city in the empire that he hadn't helped improve, and modern archaeology supports this claim. The government bureaucracy also became much more expensive. In Augustus' time, senators and knights worked in the provinces without pay, and the emperor's personal staff ran the financial offices. But now, a growing number of knights were being paid high salaries, between 100,000 and 300,000 sesterces. While this improved government operations, it also made the budget grow fast and the taxes heavier. At the time, few people complained. But when invasions and civil wars came in the next century, there were no savings left and no room to raise new taxes. And in those days, the government couldn't borrow money by selling bonds, nor were there many wealthy individuals from whom it could take large loans. In the provinces, the situation was different from place to place. Gaul was doing well, even though it sometimes protested the tax burden. Spain, overall, seemed content. The central and northern regions didn't build many new cities, and were happy with their simple lifestyles of herding animals and small-scale farming, though they sometimes complained about army recruitment. The south of Spain sent large amounts of goods to Rome as tribute. Africa was prosperous, building cities and expanding farmland quickly. But part of that success may have been due to the special attention given by Emperor Septimius Severus, who was from Africa. Asia Minor was growing with the empire's expansion, and Syria benefited from trade with the newly added ports of Mesopotamia and Arabia. Egypt, however, was not doing as well as before. The Nile still flooded regularly, fertilizing much of the land and allowing crops to grow. But this didn't mean the whole province was thriving. In earlier times, the Ptolemies and Augustus had expanded farming by building canals that brought water to lands beyond the natural flood zone. These lands could produce 2 harvests a year if farmers manually irrigated them at the start and end of the Nile flood. Because of this, the government taxed them more heavily, which made sense since farmers had time between crops to focus on irrigation. However, there were limits to how much this kind of farming could be pushed. The canals needed regular cleaning and repairs, which didn't always happen. Also, the water left sitting in the canals too long lost much of its rich nutrients. Over time, the lands used for double cropping received less and less natural fertilizer and gradually lost their productivity. This is likely why we see so many complaints from Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries about poor land quality and very high taxes. After the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire entered a period of bad leadership and civil wars that seriously damaged its entire economic system. The Emperor Commodus, who ruled like a selfish and wasteful tyrant, drained the empire's resources and weakened public morale. After his death and a brief civil war, Septimius Severus, who was from Africa, took control. He spent much of his rule fighting off rivals and enemies. His government seized large amounts of land in Italy, Spain, Gaul, and Asia, taking them into imperial control. Many local elites lost their property, and much of the wealth that once supported local communities was now used to pay Severus's loyal soldiers, court officials, and secret police. Only Africa, his home region, and Syria, the home of his wife, Julia Domna, were somewhat protected. In these places, several cities were given jus italicum, a special legal status that freed them from taxes. But this tax relief made the burden heavier for other parts of the empire. Caracalla, Severus' cruel son, and Elagabalus, his relative who had once been a priest of Baal in Syria, continued to shame the government. Their successor, Alexander Severus, was too weak to restore order or respect to the empire. What followed was a 50-year period of constant disorder. During this time, the empire suffered from repeated civil wars and foreign invasions. the Persians and Germanic tribes took advantage of the chaos to invade and loot Roman lands. Northern Gaul, the Balkans, and Syria were badly damaged. In these years, 26 men, many of them non-Romans such as Illyrians, Dalmatians, and even an Arab tribal leader named Philip and his son, became emperors. Many others tried and failed. Each new emperor found the treasury empty and had to bribe the army to gain or keep power. To raise money, they debased the currency, forced the rich to give money, confiscated property, and sometimes allowed their soldiers to loot. These power struggles weren't really political battles between rich and poor, or cities and countryside, or Romans and non-Romans. Instead, as always happens when law and order break down, ruthless people took control. Wealth, especially the kind found in cities, was attacked first and most often. By the time Diocletian was able to bring back some level of order, the empire's economy was in ruins. One of the biggest drains on the empire's money was the cost of defending against foreign attacks. It's doubtful these invasions would have been too much for strong leaders like Caesar or Trajan, but the Roman frontiers were left unguarded while the army fought itself in civil wars, making it easier for outsiders to invade. Still, pressure was building across Eastern and Central Europe due to large-scale movements of people, which would have eventually tested Rome's borders anyway. During the 3rd century, Gothic tribes began moving westward from southern Russia. At the same time, Germanic groups north of the Rhine joined together to form the Franks. In 213, Caracalla had to defend the Rhaetian frontier from Germanic tribes. Just 22 years later, Emperor Maximin was fighting the same threat along the Rhine. Around 258, the Franks captured the Agri-Decumits and mountain passes into northern Italy, which left the Italian peninsula exposed to future raids. Around the same time, the Franks invaded Gaul and parts of Spain, until they were pushed back by local Roman forces under a commander named Postumus. On the Danube River and near the Black Sea, the Goths caused just as much destruction. They continually threatened the Balkan provinces after their first raid in 228. Their naval attacks on Asia Minor and Greece in 256, 258, 263, and again from 270 to 280-284 caused serious damage. These raids also forced Rome to scatter its army thinly to defend many places at once. During this same period, a new danger rose in the east. The Sassanid dynasty took control of Persia by defeating the Parthians and began threatening the Roman Empire. Luckily, the city of Palmyra had grown strong under Roman rule and was able to act as a useful buffer state at times. But Palmyra itself became too powerful and later had to be brought back under control, at great expense to Rome. It is difficult to fully understand the economic impact of the destructive wars of the 3rd century, especially because we lack reliable numbers on how many soldiers were involved or how the costs were covered. Property damage from the invasions in Gaul, the Balkans, and Asia Minor was certainly severe for local populations, but much of it was eventually repaired once the Rhine and Danube borders were secured again. The permanent loss of regions like the Agri-Decumates and Dacia didn't seriously hurt the empire's treasury. In fact, the number of soldiers lost in these foreign wars may have been smaller than those lost in the civil wars happening at the same time. However, the constant and heavy taxes needed to support the army, buying supplies, paying salaries, feeding and clothing the troops, must be counted as one of the main reasons for the empire's financial collapse. If it had been possible to spread out the costs of these sudden wars over many years, like modern countries do using national loans, the damage might have been less severe. But back then, the cost of every year's crisis had to be taken from the taxpayers that same year. In many cases, people were taxed beyond what they could afford, and their finances never recovered. So, When historians say the 3rd century invasions and civil wars ruined the empire, they are not wrong. But these were likely symptoms of deeper problems, not the root cause. In fact, the fact that Zenobia of Palmyra alone managed to hold back Persian attacks and Postumus protected the Rhine using only Gaul's resources shows that a well-managed, smaller force could have saved the empire. To understand this period better, we need to look more closely at what happened to money, taxes, and farming. Augustus had created a stable currency system. The gold aureus was worth 1/40th of a Roman pound, and the silver denarius was set at a value ratio of 12.5 to 1. 1 aureus was worth 25 denarii. Nero later reduced the weight of the aureus to 1/45th of a pound and added copper to the silver coins, about 10% of their content. This started the gradual decline in coin value. But this change might have reflected a real increase in the value of gold and silver, since Rome was losing a lot of gold in trade with India, as Pliny noted at the time. Under Trajan and his next 3 successors, denarii included about 20% copper, while the gold aureus stayed the same. This additional decrease in silver content likely didn't cause panic in the markets, although merchants didn't trust coins that weren't based on actual metal value. Over time, the denarius dropped in value to match its real worth in silver. Adjusting to this wasn't too difficult, since the aureus remained stable and continued to serve as the main measure of value. Later, Roman legal experts, jurists, confirmed that the denarius kept losing value in relation to gold. For example, around 175 AD, the jurist Gaius set a fine at 10,000 sesterces. 50 years later, Ulpian calculated this same fine as worth 50 auri. Similarly, when Gaius once mentioned a fine of 100 auri, another jurist, Paulus, writing when the denarius had dropped to only 10% silver, said it was equal to 100,000 sesterces. Since these legal experts clearly recognized the coin's true metal content, it's safe to say bankers and merchants did too. The market had to adjust, but up to the time of Caracalla, there's no sign of any sudden financial crisis like the one experienced by Europe after World War I. Caracalla reduced the weight of the gold aureus from 1/45th to 1/50th of a pound. As the denarius was losing value and trust, he introduced a new silver coin known as the Antoninianus, or double denarius. But this coin was also made of 50% copper. Soon after, civil wars caused a shortage of money, and the decline in coin quality sped up. Each new emperor took power with no money in the treasury, but many financial obligations. Over the 50 years of chaos, the silver content of coins dropped from about 50% to less than 5%. So in half a century, the value of silver coins dropped to less than 1/10 of what they were under Caracalla. Even so, this decline in value was not much worse than what some European countries experienced after World War I, yet their economies survived. In one way, Rome had an advantage. There were no government or corporate bonds that lost value over time. The gold aureus, though rare, still existed and was used as a reliable standard for contracts. Even Diocletian, in his well-known price edict, acknowledged the true value of the debased silver coins by quoting prices in terms of a pound of gold. This suggests that every new, lower-quality coin eventually found its proper place in the market. Sometimes the government had to take harsh measures to stop people from speculating on exchange rates, but overall, the economy adjusted. Emperors Diocletian and Constantine managed to temporarily stabilize the currency by issuing a new gold coin called the solidus, weighing 1/72nd of a pound. They also brought back a silver coin similar to Nero's, which was 90% pure, and legalized small copper coins packed in sealed bags called falls, each worth about 9 solidi. At this time, the exchange ratio between metals was about 1:18 for gold to silver and 1:100 for gold to copper. This shows that gold had gained some value, but Diocletian's official price lists prove it was still being used as a standard measure. However, there is little sign of major business investment during this time. Taxes and even salaries were often paid in goods rather than money, so the economy had largely returned to a barter system, and gold or silver coins were rarely used. We can conclude that neither the shortage of precious metals nor the falling value of money was the main reason for the economic collapse before 250 AD. Instead, the decline of currency simply followed the overall decline of the government and society. Coin debasement was a result, not a cause. By the time of Constantine, charitable funds from earlier emperors, like the Alimentary programs, had lost almost all value. In the early empire, taxes under Augustus were fair and not too heavy. Italy, in fact, didn't pay direct taxes. The government ran cheaply, relying on unpaid service, and mainly spent money on maintaining peace. Later, spending increased. More roads and public buildings were constructed. The government bureaucracy became larger and more expensive. The army grew to about 400,000 soldiers under Severus, and military pay doubled. Emperors also started giving generous bonuses to soldiers. Taxes had to increase to cover these costs. In many provinces, taxes on farm goods stayed at the original levels set when Rome first conquered them. Complaints often came from how taxes were collected, not their actual rates. Roman tax officials were more detailed, did more careful land surveys, and were stricter about assessments than previous rulers. Also, when land lost fertility due to overfarming or erosion, it was hard to get tax reductions. In the cities, however, people noticed taxes rising more clearly. Property taxes, head taxes, business taxes, and sales taxes were regularly added, especially when the empire needed more money. There were also irregular extra charges. For example, crown gold, which was originally a voluntary gift from cities to new emperors, became a regular large fee demanded at every new reign. Since the 3rd century saw frequent changes in emperors, this became a real burden. Another heavy cost, especially in frontier areas, was the expectation that local people would provide food and lodging for traveling officials and armies. In peaceful times, like the 2nd century, this wasn't much worse than during the Republic. But during later crises, when emperors couldn't afford proper supply systems, hungry soldiers often took what they needed by force, which became little more than organized looting. Letters and documents from Asia and Egypt often describe these abuses. If we had as many records from the Danube region or Gaul, we would likely see the same complaints there. Finally, the system of munera, or unpaid public service, needs explanation. Both Greek and Roman governments relied heavily on citizens volunteering for local government work, especially before formal taxation and budgeting systems existed. It was considered an honor to serve. Elected officials often spent their own money on public games or buildings. But as cities grew, there were many public jobs that were hard work and brought no glory. The national government began paying salaries for these tasks, but city budgets usually did not. So city councils simply assigned men to carry out jobs at their own expense. Things like managing police, water systems, archives, roads, bathhouses, and repairs. The emperors accepted and formalized this practice. Also, when the empire stopped using private tax collectors, cities agreed to handle the collection of taxes locally, and the city councils chose members to assess and gather those taxes. Even in the 2nd century, when land became unproductive or cities began to decline, local taxes sometimes fell short of their targets. In such cases, the decuriones, the city council members, or the special tax committees appointed for the task couldn't collect the full amount. Still, the emperor demanded full payment. By the 3rd century, as these cases became more frequent, emperors declared that the decuriones were personally responsible for covering any tax shortfall. They often had to pay the missing amounts out of their own pockets. The same happened with other unpaid public duties, munera, especially when it came to the costs of feeding and housing government officials and soldiers passing through. The final burden placed on decuriones was a law requiring them to take over abandoned farms and work the land so the taxes could still be collected. Originally, decuriones could choose others to perform these public duties, but because those chosen often tried to find substitutes, the government eventually stopped allowing delays and made the responsibility fall directly on the curiales, the broader class from which decuriones were selected. Over time, holding a local office became so heavy a burden that, as the famous 50th book of the Digest shows, governments had to come up with many ways to force wealthy citizens to accept these roles. In some places, when they couldn't find enough willing people, they gave the offices to criminals, Jews, and Christians. This expansion of forced public service didn't just affect wealthy individuals. Over time, it also extended to trade guilds and merchant associations, first in Rome and later throughout the empire. Shipowners were some of the first to be controlled this way. They were promised certain privileges if they agreed to transport grain to Rome or carry military supplies. Later, when Septimius Severus provided free oil in Rome, and Aurelian added free wine and switched from giving out grain to bread, oil and wine merchants and city bakers were put under state control. Alexander Severus organized all of Rome's guilds under government supervision so they could be used for public tasks when needed. Outside Rome, this happened more slowly, but even in other towns, the smiths, lumbermen, and blanket makers were grouped into fire brigades. In return for that service, they were excused from other public duties. We don't know exactly how this system expanded over time, but laws from the 4th century show that as the state placed more duties on the guilds, members tried to leave their jobs. In response, the state made guild membership mandatory and eventually hereditary. By the middle of the 4th century, workers across the empire were locked into their professions, forming a rigid system like a caste. These workers had little freedom to leave and were required to serve the government when called upon. Tenant farmers also became tied to the land during this time. Many books have been written about how serfdom developed in the Roman Empire, but the details remain unclear. What we do know is that in the legal writings of jurists like Ulpian and Papinian, the colonus is treated as a free tenant. However, by the year 332 AD, a law issued by Constantine clearly assumes that colony were no longer free to leave the land. This law simply states that citizens had a duty to return runaway colony to their landlords, and that owners had the right to treat colony who tried to escape as slaves. Some forms of serfdom had existed in different parts of the empire before. The Roman writer Varro mentioned it in Egypt, Asia, and Illyricum, but suggested that traditional Roman law did not recognize the status. Since Rome often needed free soldiers in the provinces, the government probably didn't promote serfdom. But we can't be sure. Earlier, we saw that a mild form of serfdom existed in Asia, but there's no solid evidence that it lasted long after the time of Strabo. In fact, there is some reason to think that emperors considered temple tenants as free people. Some historians point to fixed labor duties in Egypt and labor obligations from tenants on imperial lands in Africa as early signs of serfdom. But these duties were not the same as being legally bound to the land and should not be confused with true serfdom. The change in the legal status of the colony was a major shift. It suggests two things. First, that these farmers were already in a very low social position, which had likely been declining for a long time. And second, that there was a major crisis that pushed the emperor to take extreme action. To understand why the colony accepted this loss of freedom, we should remember that many were the sons or grandsons of former slaves who had been freed and given farmland because there weren't enough free laborers. In other cases, captured foreigners were used as semi-free tenants. Sometimes, emperors gave their freed slaves small plots of land on state-owned estates. In many regions, poor local farmers who had probably never gained full Roman citizenship were already working as colony. On these large estates, tenants rarely had contact with the real landowner and instead had to obey the harsh orders of farm managers, who often worked with imperial tax officials. Short-term rental agreements had almost disappeared, especially on state estates. Most tenants were now stuck in lifelong arrangements based only on custom, without written contracts to protect them. Under these conditions, the tenants became increasingly dependent on the decisions of landowners and their agents. But a gradual drop in social status alone doesn't explain the total loss of freedom. This must have come from an official law, though it hasn't survived, and it likely came during the crises at the end of the 3rd century, between 235 and 285 AD, during constant civil war and chaos. The empire was desperate for taxes and food. Land was the most reliable source of both. Under Emperor Aurelian, when tenants began abandoning their land because of high taxes and poor harvests, local city officials were made responsible for the full tax amounts. Landowners were forced to take over abandoned plots. Their likely response was, "We can take the land only if we are allowed to keep our tenants." The emperor faced similar problems on state-owned lands, where tenant farming had drained the soil and piracy disrupted trade and lowered prices. It's possible that the rule tying tenants to the land first started on imperial estates. When Diocletian later had to collect taxes in the form of produce due to the failure of the money system, his many officials probably monitored farmland carefully and reported tenants who had left. As we've already seen, colony were no longer free by 332 AD. The laws that made them legally bound to the land were probably issued during the late 3rd century crises or early in Diocletian's rule. As historians have long noted, this system of serfdom went hand in hand with other laws of the time. Laws that forced decuriones to serve for life and made tradesmen stay in their guilds. Serfdom took hold more quickly for the colony than for others, because they were the key group responsible for producing taxes and food. In the short term, serfdom may have brought some stability to farming, since colony now knew that trying to escape could result in being treated like a slave. But as historian Westermann noted, the empire was now depending on unwilling and unmotivated farmers who had little reason to care about producing food. The problems of this system only grew. Now, most people working the land couldn't become landowners. Some landowners went bankrupt due to heavy taxes and uncooperative labor. Meanwhile, others who had government connections or who could bribe officials avoided taxes. These wealthier individuals bought up land at low prices from failing owners, gained more through political favors, and became part of the emperor's circle of elite supporters. The result of this system, the colonate, was a rapid increase in large privately owned estates known as latifundia. Diocletian made big changes to the military, financial, and government systems. His new system was large, strict, and very organized. At the center of it was the army, which he expanded to include both mobile forces and border guards. He also divided the empire into smaller administrative regions, each full of paid officials. These officials were responsible for collecting taxes, reporting any issues, and keeping watch over the population. Taxes had to go up again because the cost of running the empire kept rising. For the first time, taxes were collected across the whole empire using the same system. However, the tax rate was not fixed. It was announced each year based on the needs of the empire. Because the economy had fallen apart, and people had gone back to bartering instead of using money, Diocletian decided it would be easier to collect taxes in goods instead of coins. So, a new way of measuring taxes was created, though it was expensive to set up. All farmland was reevaluated based on how productive it was. The basic tax unit was called a jugum, which equaled 20 acres of good land, 40 acres of medium land, or 60 acres of poor land. Vineyards and olive groves, which were more valuable than grain fields, were taxed by how many plants they had. Pasture lands were taxed based on how many animals they supported. Each farm worker was also taxed as if they were one jugum, and the landowner had to pay that tax. Since the cities were responsible for bringing in the taxes, the emperor didn't need to hire more collectors. But he did have to build many granaries and hire workers to manage them, since much of the taxes now came in as grain. This grain was then given to soldiers and government workers instead of paying them in money. This system was very expensive to maintain. It shows how badly Roman trade and business had broken down. Land taxes were the main source of income for the government, but taxes on jobs and trades were also strictly enforced. The crown gold, once a gift to new emperors, was now demanded every 5 years from city leaders, and Roman senators were forced to pay a special tax called aurum oblaticium. When Diocletian tried to fix the coinage system, many people started speculating and changing prices because they believed the reforms would not last. To fight this, in 301 AD, he created a list of maximum prices for goods and services. These lists were displayed publicly, especially in the eastern part of the empire, where Roman coins were now replacing local money for the first time. Diocletian's goal was to keep prices low, especially for labor and basic items, so it's likely he set the value of the denarius a bit too high compared to gold. Still, the price list is useful for comparing the costs of goods at the time and is important for historians. Unfortunately, we can't compare these prices with earlier ones because we don't have many records outside of Egypt. However, we do know that the price of wheat in gold during Diocletian's time was about the same as it was in Cicero's time. Since wheat was a major part of people's diets and the economy, this suggests that prices hadn't changed much overall. Also, the price list doesn't show signs of a major wheat shortage or soil failure. Sea trade was still active and could bring grain to areas in need. Another important point is that Diocletian was able to bring back the older Neronian silver coin, which was 90% pure silver, and issue enough gold coins to back the new currency system. This shows that a shortage of precious metals was not a serious cause of Rome's problems. It's harder to compare wages because Diocletian's list includes food as part of workers' daily pay. But the fact that food was included is meaningful. It shows how basic goods were becoming more important than money in everyday life. If there had been many big building projects during this time, we would expect workers like masons and carpenters to be paid in money. But if they were only doing small repairs for landlords, then it makes sense that they were paid partly in food. In reality, almost no new buildings were made during the period of civil war and chaos. The only major construction came from public projects done by soldiers or government slaves. So few buildings were built that the decorative arts nearly disappeared, and the design and craftsmanship of the time became very poor. The fact that food was included in wages shows how badly industry had fallen apart. Still, wages stayed about the same, around 11 cents in food per day, which was close to the old wage of 1 denarius. This might seem strange since the economy was in decline, but it can be explained by the fact that while there was less demand for labor, there were also fewer slaves, and more workers were legally tied to jobs or farms. This is not the place to go into detail about Rome's final collapse from barbarian invasions, but we can briefly look at the situation in different parts of the empire before the end. Egypt, for example, was less affected by invasions than other regions. However, even though it had a large population, many people there were not useful for defending the empire. The Nile River still allowed Egypt to produce enough grain to feed Constantinople, the new capital. The government was also able to protect the grain ships. Emperor Probus even had soldiers clean and repair canals, which helped farming improve in the 4th century after a decline in the 3rd. Archaeological digs in places like Karanis show that farming in the Fayum area stayed productive for about 200 years afterward. Still, economic conditions in Egypt were not great. Diocletian's order to make Egypt use Roman coins and pricing laws probably disrupted local trade and traditions. In response, people started using their own local coins again to suit their needs. The Roman government was no longer effective, and the heavy tax burden caused unrest. Powerful individuals started buying up land, forming private territories, avoiding taxes, and ignoring the state's rules. Religious disagreements also grew because of intense support for different Christian groups and monasteries. So even though Egypt had rich resources, it was breaking apart into weaker, divided regions, making it easy for the Arabs to conquer later. The cities in Asia and Syria were badly damaged during the wars with Persia, not just by the enemy, but also by undisciplined Roman soldiers who constantly passed through the area. Most of the people living there had never been used to a life of peace and safety. Large cities only existed along the coast where Greek influence was strong, but even those cities stopped growing after the 2nd century. Most people lived in simple villages and survived day to day. Their small farms and homes were not worth stealing. These areas had always followed a basic, rural economy. The coastal Syrians were more involved in trade. Even in the 5th century, they traded with Gaul, and they supported stable government to keep sea routes safe. Inland Syrians understood the need to defend the border and did their part to support the eastern part of the empire. There was still a strong sense of community and identity among the people. They had adopted parts of Greek culture that were useful, but rejected much of the Roman way of life. They accepted Christianity because it felt similar to their traditional beliefs and added some of their own religious ideas into it. Christianity united them in a powerful way. Their bishops and priests became very influential, not only locally, but even far into the western parts of the empire. Asia still had a lot of energy and cultural strength, but it was clear that its people were not suited to follow the Roman Western model.